Alright, so this is going to be the last video I make for this series, and of course, proceeding after this video will be the official start of me going over the medieval time period in Europe, and over the various so-called black rulers who were ruling or who were in power during this time period, along with just the people of Europe in general who were living during this era. But before we get to that, we have to talk about something that may be deemed as quote-unquote controversial, which is pertaining to pertaining to so-called black people's history or their origins in America and how a lot of our people got to America. Of course, the main way in which we're told, and really not just us, but every other demographic for the most part, is told that so-called blacks came to America was primarily and really almost exclusively by way of the slave trade from Africa to the Americas, which is better known, of course, as the transatlantic slave trade. So much is made about this event and time period in conventional historical narrative, and a lot of it revolves around the concerted attempts to try and make the so-called black man and black woman believe that this is where our official history started. According to the historical narrative, so-called blacks had very little to no known recorded history anywhere in the world of note to teach of in constructs like the educational system, and then even during quote-unquote Black History Month that we have out here in this country, and then even in things like movies or books that really only document so-called blacks as being slaves and nothing else. And this should let our people know that there is something not quite right with how our history is taught, because no other nation or race on the planet Earth gets told that their history started with slavery. Even other quote-unquote downtrodden groups, like the Native Americans, for example, get told that they built advanced civilizations and were the first settlers of this land that we call America today. They even get told that they had so-called blacks enslaved, which is where you allegedly get a lot of the black Native American groups like the Black Seminoles from. So even though they were colonized, and that colonization has been made to be a big part of their history, and most of which was orchestrated by so-called blacks, by the way, the colonization of America was. But even though that's part of their history, they still get told that they were something more before they became conquered and ultimately became almost as downtrodden in their communities as so-called blacks are in our communities today. And the reason why they do this is because obviously they don't want us to know who we really are and how a lot of us actually came here into the Americas, at least those of us who weren't already here as the Aboriginal Americans. Okay, but what oftentimes isn't mentioned, and will probably never get mentioned, is how a good amount of our people came to this country through three different means. Not just one, which of course we know which was through the slave trade from Africa to the Americas. As I already mentioned, a lot of so-called black people were already here in the Americas, particularly in North America, and probably even in greater numbers in South America. But that will be a series in and of itself later on down the line when I do my series on the so-called black Native Americans. But the third way our people came here was from Europe, through a lot of the conflicts that were going on in Europe around the 17th century to the 18th century, as well as our colonization of America, especially North America. Most, if not all, of the 13 colonies were named after so-called black monarchs. Colonies like Virginia, which was named in honor of the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I. Even one of the more prominent cities in Virginia, where some of the first slaves were brought to in North America in 1619, were taken to, was Jamestown, which was named after King James VI/I. And then you have others like Louisiana, which was named after Louis XIV, and then the Carolinas, which were named after King Charles I, and also Charleston or Charlestown, North Carolina, which was named after his son, who was deemed or dubbed as the quote-unquote black boy during his lifetime, Charles II. That city in North Carolina was named after him, and then so on and so forth. These colonies were created by so-called blacks. Okay, and even the colonization of South America, which was first commissioned by Ferdinand II of Aragon, who was the king of Spain at the time, and then later it was continued on by Charles V, Philip II, Philip III, etc. All of those were initialized, all those colonization missions were initialized by so-called blacks. So that is one way our people came to the Americas from Europe. But the more prolific way in which blacks came from Europe to the Americas was through being transported over during the aftermath of a lot of the internal conflicts that were going on in Europe at the time. I briefly mentioned one of those conflicts in my second video from this series, where I talked about the Jacobite rebellions. But adjacent to this conflict that was going on all over the British Isles was another conflict that was going on mainly in Scotland, which was known to history as the Highland Clearances. So let's talk a little bit about the Highland Clearances and see who these people were that were being kicked out of their home country in Scotland. So the events that predated the Highland Clearances shape what eventually would come to pass during this traumatic event in Scotland's history. First, there was the deterioration of the clan system, which was something that was in place for hundreds of years until the reign of King James VI and I, who kept a lot of the clan chiefs away from their clans for extended periods of time by making them perform tasks away from their respective towns in Scotland. And King James did this so that the clans would feel more compelled to pledge their allegiance to him and the British/Scottish crown rather than their clan chief, and this would be something that eventually would become a normal way of thinking amongst the Highlanders, this led to them getting involved in an event that would occur hundreds of years after the reign of King James VI and I, that showed just how much the Highlanders had become more loyal to the kings rather than their clan chiefs. This was an event that I referenced in my second video in this series, which was the Jacobite rebellions. And as I was able to show in that video, a lot of the Jacobites that tried to fight for the restoration of the Stuarts in England, Scotland, and Ireland after they had been replaced by the Hanoverians were so-called black, but I'll reintroduce that a little bit later. But yes, the Highland Scots had gotten involved in the Jacobite rebellion due to the feelings of allegiance that they had towards the Stuart line of kings, which was even more fermented when a legislation known as the Act of Union of 1707 was introduced to these countries of England and Scotland and sought to unite the kingdoms together. The Highland Scots felt that a union between them and the English was not in their best interest, so this created an even more widespread opposition to the new monarchs of England. This did not bode well for the Highlanders, though, and this led to the English monarchy, led by King George I, to disperse garrisons of English soldiers all around the Scottish Highlands to suppress their opposition against the king and encourage their need to rebel any further. All of this culminated itself in 1746 at by far the most well-known conflict of the Jacobite rebellion's history, which was the Battle of Culloden, which resulted in a crushing defeat of the Jacobites at the hand of the British Army, and led to a lot of the Jacobites, many of which were members of Highland clans, to be either imprisoned and shipped off to another country, or just straight up killed after they had been found attempting to flee. And the end of the Battle of Culloden was essentially the last straw for the British monarchy and their tolerance of the Highlanders, so they went about trying to find any reason possible they could to extricate the Highlanders out of their ancestral homelands. One of the main ways they justified exiling the Highlanders from their isles was through the burgeoning wool trade in Scotland, which caused landowners who presided over the territories that had belonged to a lot of these Scottish Highland clan members to adopt this belief that sheep were far more valuable financially than the people who were working on those lands at the time. Essentially stating that sheep were worth more than people. So this led to an organized removal of a lot of the Highlander population from their ancestral homelands. And so this was one of the ways that they were removed. But yet another way was when the Heritable Jurisdictions Act of 1747 was passed, which outright stated that those who did not submit to English rule would be automatically forced out of their ancestral homelands forever. So these things, along with other reasons for why the Highlanders left their homelands, such as voluntary immigration or being sold into indentured servitude, or why from about 1750 to 1860, this event known as the Highland Clearances, which saw around 70,000 Highlanders in total being forced or willingly leave their ancestral homelands happened. And as I stated earlier, most of these Scottish Highlanders and Highland clans were so-called black, and a large percent of the estimated 70,000 exiled Highlanders emigrated to America, and this immigration didn't take place all at once, but in multiple different waves. So I believe the first wave of Highlanders that immigrated to America numbered at around 350, and they settled in and around the Cape Fear River area in North Carolina in 1739. But the second wave would prove to be by far the biggest one, which numbered around like 20,000 or so Highland Scots that also immigrated to the Cape Fear area in North Carolina. So that's about an estimated over 20,000 Highlanders in total that we know of who were prompted to leave their homelands and migrate out here into America. And of course, the other 50,000 or so immigrated to other areas of the world, such as Canada and even Australia and even to the lowland areas of Scotland. But we're just going to focus mainly on the ones who immigrated to America because, again, we're trying to trace where a lot of so-called blacks of the United States of America's ancestry lies in Europe. But anyway, let's take a look at seeing how the Highland Scots were described in general as a people to prove my point that most of the Highland Scots were indeed so-called blacks. So now let's read a couple of descriptions of the Highlanders as a whole, and then we'll just briefly take a look at a few individual isles and clans that the Highlanders derive from. So let's start out by looking at this first description right here of the Highlanders. And before I read, and even as I read this excerpt, I just want you guys to pay attention to the distinction that this author makes between the Highlanders and the other demographic of Scots who are known as the quote-unquote Lowlanders, as well as the difference between the quote-unquote English and other inhabitants of the British Isles. Okay, so now let's read what this has to say. So everyone who has been in North Britain knows that the Lowlanders of that country are as different from the Highlanders as the English are from the Welsh. So again, take notice of that distinction this author makes between these two parties. We're reading on. The race is so extremely distinct as to strike all at first sight. In person, the Lowlanders are tall and large with fair complexions and often with flaxen, yellow, and red hair and blue eyes, the grand features of the Goths and all ancient writers. The lower classes of the Highlanders are generally diminutive, if we accept some of Norwegian descent, with brown complexions and almost always with black curled hair and dark eyes. So a couple of things here. For number one, I told you guys to pay attention to the distinction this author makes between the Lowlanders and the Highlanders for a reason, and it's because of the clear intentional distinction this author makes between the two, not only as a culture, but as an entirely different race of people altogether. The author quite literally says that the two are extremely distinct or different from one another, and one would be able to tell the difference upon first glance. So this is important because it establishes that these were not just two groups of so-called Caucasians that just appeared to look different from one another. No, these were two completely distinct races of people, which was obvious when you look at how their physical characteristics were described. And also the difference that he makes between the so-called English and Welsh will also prove to be important later on when I speak about the comments that were made by Benjamin Franklin in relation to the difference between the people who refer to as the quote-unquote Saxons or English and other peoples of Europe, and how he clearly made distinctions as well between them and the other peoples of Europe. But anyway, just looking at the main description of the complexion of the Highlanders, these people clearly and obviously sound like so-called black people. He describes them as having brown complexions and having black curled hair, which are clearly the physical characteristics of so-called black people, especially the black curled hair. It has already been proven that the demographic or race of people that have the highest frequency of curly hair on the planet Earth are so-called blacks. And of course, our people come in various shades of brown as well. So again, these two descriptions should easily be identified as so-called black features. So this is our first piece of evidence regarding what the appearance of the Highlanders was, but now let's take a look at another one. So now this book was written by a man by the name of Samuel Stanhope, who actually lived during the time period of the Highland clearances and actually published this book in 1787, which was right in the midst of this event. And he's actually most known for writing books on and about Scotland. So this is a guy who is a good authority on what the Scottish were like at this time. But let's read what he has to say regarding the complexion of the Highlanders during this time period. So among the Highlanders of Scotland, the predominant complexions are black and red. So wow, this guy states that the predominant or vast majority of the peoples who would identify as quote-unquote Highlanders complexion was black. And then he states that it also was red, which I take to mean ruddy. And by this time, the word ruddy was still kind of sort of meant to imply that someone was of a quote-unquote reddish-brownish skin color. The definition did in fact start to change around this time period, so I'm not quite sure if that was the same definition when this guy wrote this book. But this man undoubtedly states that the predominant complexions of these Scottish Highlanders was indeed black. So that would mean that a lot of the Highlanders had to have been of a so-called black complexion and will be classified as quote-unquote black if they were around today, which many of their descendants do still live today, but we'll go over that a little bit later. But yes, according to this man, the Scottish Highlanders were indeed of a black complexion, and you know, there were various descriptions that were made of the inhabitants of individual isles that were inhabited by the Highlanders that back up this statement made by Mr. Samuel Stanhope. So let's take a look at what some of those have to say. So now we're going to just read some descriptions of some of the more well-known Highland Isles in Scotland, and we're going to start off with looking at the Isle of Skye. And this description was cited from a man who quotes a historian who wrote a book titled A Description of the Western Isles, and his book actually predates the Highland clearances. So this description was made way before any of the Highlanders were even kicked out of their lands, and still maintained their original physical characteristics. So let's read about how the Highlanders of Skye were described in this book. So the inhabitants of this isle are generally well proportioned, and their complexion for the most part black. So once again, we see another man who lived during the time of the original inhabitants of the Scottish Highlands that states that they were indeed of a black complexion. So now let's look at another one. So let's read and see how the inhabitants of the Highland Scottish Isle of Jura were described. And this is from the same book, or from the same exact man who wrote the book, Description of the Western Isles in Scotland. So now, let's read what this guy has to say here. And once again, just keep in mind that he wrote this book, the author of this book wrote this book way before the Scottish Highland clearances were even taking place. Let's read his description real quick here. The natives here are well proportioned, being generally black of complexion and free from bodily imperfections. They speak the Irish language. And I wanted to just add that last part about them speaking the Irish language in there, because that's going to be a very important thing to remember for later on. But once again, another Highland Scottish Isle, another Scottish island and isle inhabitants were described as having a black complexion. So this is a common theme that should be clear as to why it keeps being seen. Is because once again, these people were clearly of so-called black color, or they were of so-called black complexions. The Highlanders were. But let's just take a look at one last description of the Highlanders from this same book. And this time we're going to take a look at the Highlanders that came from the Isle of Colonsay. And I want to take a look at them because there's an interesting dichotomy that is made between the, again, original Scottish Highlanders and the modern inhabitants of the Scottish Highlands, which shows us that the true Highlanders, for the most part, no longer exist there anymore. But anyway, let's read what this has to say about the inhabitants of Colonsay. So the inhabitants are generally well proportioned and of a black complexion. They speak only the Irish tongue. So again, remember that last part of this sentence for later. But anyway, we can see clearly here that the inhabitants of the Isle of Colonsay were described as having a black complexion, right? And again, this book that I'm reading from was published before the Highland clearances. I believe the exact publication date of its release was like 1695 or 1699, but either way, it was made before the Highland clearances. So we see how they were described before the clearances. So now let's see who their replacements were, how their replacements were described real quick. So now this book was published almost 20 years after the Highland clearances were over. Okay, so by now the Aboriginal Highlanders have been kicked out, and now there was a new crop of so-called Highlanders that were introduced into isles like Colonsay, which of course was the aforementioned isle I just read about in my last description. And we read how they were described before the clearances. So now let's read how they looked after. So in Colonsay, fair and sandy hair is frequent, and the complexion is usually fair. So now this is a stark contrast to how the Highlanders that inhabited Colonsay were described before, right? Were not the Highlanders of Colonsay, some almost 200 years before this book was written, described as having a black complexion? How all of a sudden do they have fair complexions and fair hair? How does that happen unless once again the so-called Caucasian has started to take over Europe and inhabited a lot of the lands that blacks originally had and presided over, while also claiming the identity of the people who were originally there? Okay, I've been telling you guys this since really the very first video in this series, which is that the Caucasian incrementally started to take over Europe in more ways than one, which is why down to today, the vast majority of the population of Europe is Caucasian or so-called white, or at least they look so-called white. And it did not used to be like this at all or whether people want to believe it or not, but yes, so-called blacks inhabited and ruled over Europe before the Caucasian ever did. Okay, but if you need any further proof that European peoples, such as the Highlanders, were not so-called Caucasians, let's take a look at one more piece of evidence that will definitively prove that these Highlanders that existed during the ancient times of Scotland, all the way to when they were kicked out of their ancestral homelands, were so-called blacks. Before I get into what I'm about to read, I just want you guys to remember the very first book that gave a description of the Highlanders I read from, that made a clear distinction between the Lowlanders and the Highlanders of Scotland, and how the author literally described the Lowlanders, who were clearly depicted as Caucasian in the book, and the Highlanders, who were clearly depicted as people of color or so-called blacks with brown complexions and black curled hair, which are stated were so-called black features. But anyway, let's take a look at what I'm talking about real quick. So let's read this quick little excerpt right here that will help us understand how the Highlanders were described, again, before they were completely kicked out of Scotland, while the Highland clerics were going on from 1760 to 1850. Okay, so let's read what this excerpt states about how the Highlanders were classified by a British soldier who actually founded the colony today, the state of Georgia, James Oglethorpe. And he lived during the midst of the Highland clerics, James Oglethorpe did. So let's see how he classified the Highlanders and who he likened them to. So starting with Callaway. So Callaway borrows his title from Georgia's founder, James Oglethorpe, who raised a motley army of white people. So now if the Highlanders were indeed so-called Caucasians, they should have been placed under this category, right? Let's read further to see who they were grouped with. So they were grouped with, white people, Indians, and Highlanders to fight against Spanish Floridians. In Oglethorpe's time, many Britons categorized Highland Scots and Indians as savage non-whites. So this is very, very interesting. The Highland Scots, people of Scotland, Europeans of Scottish descent, who are supposed to be Caucasian, are described as non-whites by this man, James Oglethorpe, who once again lived while the Aboriginal Highlanders were still in Scotland. We've already seen how they were described as uniformly being considered people of brown and black complexion by actual people who visited the Isles of Scotland and saw what the inhabitants of the Highlands looked like. And once again, the very first description I read of the Highlanders that described them as having a brown complexion and black curled hair stated that they looked completely distinct from the fair complexion and fair-haired Lowlanders who were not of Scottish descent. I believe they were so-called German or English, but they weren't even the real descendants of the Germanic peoples or the English Anglo-Saxons, but that'll be another story for another day. But just getting back to the point, yes, the Highlanders were so-called blacks, and those of you who have surnames like Morgan, Murray, Grant, Monroe, Stewart, Campbell, Graham, McNabb, Buchanan, Kennan or McKinnon, Donald, MacDonald, so on and so forth, chances are you are descended from these so-called black Scottish Highlanders who were victims of the Highland clearances and migrated out to America. But there were, of course, other groups of Europeans that migrated and were shipped out to America in droves of tens and hundreds of thousands. One of these groups being the Irish. Now there were many Irish immigrants that arrived from Ireland to America. They numbered about 250,000, that arrived during America's colonial period, and then from 1720 to 1820, 468,400 were arrived from Ireland to America. One of the many ways the Irish came to America when they first arrived was by slavery or indentured servitude, mainly in and around the mid-1600s, around like 1650 to 1660. A lot of these Irish slaves slash servants were also sent to areas like the Caribbean, to areas like Montserrat, and a good number of them, not every single one, but a good number of these Scottish Irish convicts that were sold into slavery were so-called black. If you guys remember a little bit ago, I referenced how the Highlanders of Jura and Colonsay, who were both documented to have been of a so-called black complexion, were also documented as being natural native speakers of the quote-unquote Irish tongue or dialect. And the reason for this is because the ancient peoples of Scotland and the Irish have always had an interconnectivity with one another, starting with the reign of an Irish/Scottish king named Kenneth MacAlpin, when they were both united as two kingdoms. But the connection goes back even farther than this, from around the time of the Roman occupation of Britain as was documented by the 6th century British monk Gildas, who himself alluded to the fact that the Scots, which was actually a term that was originally in reference to the ancient Irish, which were where we get the word Scotland from, but he referred to the Scots and the Picts, or the native inhabitants of Scotland, as a quote-unquote duskish swarm of vermin. The word duskish is derivative of dusky, and I believe I went over in my last video very briefly that the term dusky quite literally meant something that is tending to blackness. So Gildas was basically calling the Scots and the Picts a people of color, and we can see that this has to be correct because, again, their descendants such as the Highlanders of Jura and Colonsay, along with a bevy of other Highland Scottish tribes, were documented as being a people of color, or so-called black in complexion, right? So this infusion of cultures between the Irish and the Scottish peoples led to the ancestors of the Highlanders, who were the Picts, to adopt things such as the Gaelic language, which was created by the ancient Irish and was still being spoken by themselves and the people of Scotland around this time period when the Scottish and the Irish were being kicked out of their lands. And once again, these two groups of people were so-called black, both the Scottish and the Irish, or at least the original Scottish and Irish, that were coming under siege by people like Oliver Cromwell, who was kicking a lot of the Irish from their native lands after he came into power after the death of King Charles I of England. And again, a lot of these Irish who were made into indentured servants and even outright slaves were being shipped to places like America and even the Caribbean, and the presence of the Irish, mostly the ones that were people of color, caused the need for a book to be written which questioned the presence of people in Ireland who had Irish last names, but were, for number one, so-called black, and for number two, did not have any ancestry that came from African slaves. But let's see what I'm talking about and take a look at the book From Whence Came the Black Irish real quick. Alright, so we're going to read a couple of paragraphs from this book, From Whence Came the Black Irish, to see that the presence of so-called blacks from Ireland did actually exist, at least within the Caribbean, but we'll see a little bit later that they also came to America as well. And of course, it should already be understood that there were a lot of so-called blacks that have Irish last names, or there are a lot of so-called blacks that have Irish last names in America, who are in fact descended from these ancient black Irish that came from Ireland. But we'll see that in a little bit here when we get into it. But let's read what this book has to say real quick, starting at the very top of this intro page. So visitors to Jamaica and the British West Indies frequently remark a seeming anomaly and even the remotest sections of the quote-unquote bush and among the darkest of the Negroes, who clearly trace their ancestry back to the earliest slaves of Africa. And I want you guys to keep this last statement in mind as we read and even as we go through this investigation of where these black Irish went, because so many so-called blacks, even from around this time, as this book was written, I believe it was written around the early 1900s or the late 1800s, but either way, even from back then, so-called blacks were still trying to heavily stick to the slave narrative as a way to trace back their lineage. But as we'll read in a minute, the likelihood is that these people did not descend from slaves in Africa, but let's just keep reading. But they will find distinctively Irish names so common that in an unguarded moment, they are apt to give flight to the imagination that the claim that they have actually encountered a touch of the quote-unquote brogue. A few years ago in one school in Kingston might be found Burke, Collins, Mackey, McDermott, McKeon, and Walsh. With one exception, the last name was a dusky brown. They were to all appearances full-blooded Negroes. So all these so-called black children had Irish last names, but they had no infusion of so-called Caucasian blood in their appearance, according to this author. Except for maybe the last kid who he says was of a dusky brown color, right? I told you guys that the term dusky or duskish was the word that the 5th century English monk Gildas that I mentioned earlier used to describe the Scots or Irish and the Picts, right? So that was indeed a term for people of color, and the author uses it to describe what seems like a possibly mixed race so-called black kid, but he's still a child with so-called black lineage. But anyway, again, the author says that these kids were all quote-unquote full-blooded Negroes with no infusion of white or Caucasian blood in their genome. So they couldn't have gained those names from having a so-called Caucasian father, right? So that explanation is out the window. But most people will probably think, oh, well, they just got those names from slave masters who gave them their last names. But let's read forward and see that what this author has to say about that. So in a single classroom for another school, there were Collins, Kennedy, McCormick, and O'Hare. And here again, In only one case did the features or complexion indicate any infusion of Caucasian blood, although this too was as black as the rest. This child too was as black as the rest. Perhaps one of the names most frequently met with throughout the island is that of Burke. In some few instances, it is true the name itself may be a corruption of that of the Haitian refugee de Bourg, who came to Jamaica in the 18th century at the time of the Haitian uprising. The usual explanation given for the presence of Irish names is, of course, that the slaves of former days were generally called by the family name of the master. But in the case of Burke, at least we do not find a single planter of that name among the early records of Jamaica. Certainly, the survey of the year 1670 shows that at that time, not 1 acre of land was owned by anyone named Burke. And the same may be said in the case of most of the other Irish names we encounter today among the Negroes of the island. I can guarantee you that that's the case because, like I've been telling you guys all throughout this segment of the video, the original peoples of Ireland were indeed so-called black. And their descendants, some of which are mentioned in this book, were shipped off to places like the Caribbean, which is mainly where this book focuses on. But we want to see where a lot of these black Irish were shipped to in America as well. So let's just take a look at some documentation of these so-called black Irish men and women who came over to America either as immigrants or as indentured servants. So this is a book that documents the names of certain individuals who served in the militia based in a county in Pennsylvania known as Lancaster. And please keep in mind that this book was written in and around the same time that a lot of the Irish were being casted out of Ireland into various different areas of the world, which one, of course, being America. I believe this book was originally published in 1644, so again, that's right in line with when the Irish were starting to come under siege by the external forces that sought to rid them out of their lands. So let's just read how some of these people, particularly the Irish, were described in these archives. And please keep in mind that this book actually states that these people came from Ireland, not that they were slaves that were shipped from Africa to Ireland to the Americas. Okay, so let's read about a few of these people, starting with the man who quite literally has the exact same name as one of the surnames that I had mentioned from the Whence Came the Black Irish book. He has the last name Burke, and as you can see right here, and as the Whence Came the Black Irish book stated, there was no known slaver or planter with that last name Burke that could be traced all the way back to the mid-1600s in Ireland. So this man's description right here should tell us a little bit about why this was, which was due to the fact that the Irish last name Burke was just a natural surname for the original so-called Black Irish. Let's read this man's description real quick. So Edward Burke, aged 30 years, 5 foot 8 inches high, black hair, black complexion, and then what does it say after that? Born in Ireland. Okay, not a slave that was brought to Ireland from Africa, but this man, who was described as being someone with a black complexion, was actually born in Ireland, meaning he was a native Irish man. Now, how many so-called black people do you see in Ireland today who are actually natives of Ireland? Not that many, right? And a lot of this was because, of course, the expulsion of Aboriginal Irish out of Ireland, as well as Aboriginal Irish that were immigrating out of Ireland, but also a lot of the original Irish were killed off, especially over the decade-long time span from 1641 to 1652, where it's been documented that about 550,000 Irish were being killed off by Oliver Cromwell and the English. And a lot of these were the Aboriginal so-called black Irish men and women that had inhabited Ireland for centuries. So this is where a lot of the black Irish went, and it's also why so many Caucasians reside in Ireland today. I believe Ireland is said to be one of the most quote-unquote white or Caucasian places on the planet Earth today in terms of population, and is about on the same level as places like the areas in Scandinavia in terms of their domineering so-called Caucasian population numbers. But anyway, let's read more descriptions that are given in this book about Irish men who were documented as being people of color, because this one Irish man that I just referenced is far from the only one that is mentioned. Now, this description, along with a couple more descriptions of so-called black Irishmen who are listed in this book, will get my point across that there were a multitude of these quote-unquote black Irish that existed and actually came from Ireland, which was their native homeland. And the Aboriginal so-called black Irish and other Europeans will be a topic that I will cover in far greater depth in later series that I have coming down the pike later on. So this is just a little snippet of what I will show when I do those series. But anyway, let's take a look at some of these Irish men and how they were described, starting with this man right here, John Campbell. So John Campbell, aged 40 years, 5 feet 8 inches high, black hair, black complexion, and was born in Ireland. So yet again, another so-called black Irishman that was originally from Ireland, as it states right here. He was born in Ireland. So let's go down and see another one real quick. So let's read how this man Samuel Crawford was described. And that name Crawford is actually derivative of, I believe, the Anglo-Saxon or even the Anglo-Normans, which were a composite of Normans and Anglo-Saxons. So this guy might not have been an Irishman by lineage, but we'll just read his description anyway because it'll just help further prove that so-called blacks did in fact have a history that went all the way back to other European groups like the Normans and the Saxons. And a lot of so-called blacks that have that last name have that last name Crawford today. A lot of you guys most likely have your lineage that goes going back to the Anglo-Saxons or even the Anglo-Norman ancestry. But anyway, let's just read this description of Mr. Samuel Crawford real quick. So Samuel Crawford, age 20 years, 5 feet 5 inches high, black hair, black complexion, and then it goes on to say that he was born in Ireland. But again, he might have just been an immigrant into Ireland and not an actual Irish man. But he was still clearly a so-called black European man. Let's take a look at another one. So now let's see how this man William Griffin was described. And again, this last name Griffin is another last name so-called blacks have as well. And it has its origins mainly in the Welsh and Irish. So if you have this last name, it most likely is your real last name. But let's go about reading this description of William Griffin real quick. So William Griffin, aged 25 years, 5 feet 10 inches high, black hair, black complexion, born in Ireland. So once again, yet another so-called black Irishman that is listed from this document. So it should be obvious by now that there were indeed native so-called blacks that came from Ireland and had a history in Ireland going back some centuries. But even still, I want to just go over a couple more people on this archives list just to get my point across. So let's read about this man right here named John Harkin. And even though this excerpt says that he's from America, that last name Harkin actually goes back to Ireland and to the old Irish Gaelic name O'Here Can. So this is most likely an Irish immigrant that went to America, but let's read his description. So John Harkin, age 23 years, 5 feet 10 inches high, brown hair, and black complexion. And again, it says that he was from America, but like I stated, his lineage goes back to Ireland, as is evidenced by his surname Harkin. So now let's read another one real quick. So James Jacks, aged 54 years, 5 feet 8 inches high, gray hair, black complexion, born in Ireland. And then here's yet another one. Robert Kenny, 22 years, 5 feet 10 inches high, black hair, black complexion, born in Ireland. And then Neil Kenny, age 21, 5 feet 5 inches high, black hair, black complexion, born in Ireland. And then Barnabas Lafarty, age 27, 5 feet 6 inches high, black hair, black complexion, born in Ireland. And that last name Lafarty has ancient history going all the way back to the northern regions of Ireland. So this man was for sure a native Aboriginal Irish man. And then going down to a man by the name of Thomas McCahey, who has a last name that also goes back to ancient Ireland, which means descendant of MacDa, and is found in the region of Ireland known as Ormond. And just as an aside, what's interesting about that region in Ireland known as Ormond is it was a territory that was ruled over by an Irish noble family by the name of the Butlers. And one of their descendants, Thomas Butler, who was the, I believe, 10th Earl of Ormond, was a very close confidant of Queen Elizabeth I, who was the daughter of King Henry VIII. And this man, Thomas Butler, was described as having a black complexion, just like the various other Irishmen that I've read about so far in this video. So he was another Irish man that was described as having a black complexion. And again, the family he derived from, the Butlers, were an ancient Irish family from that region of Ormond. So if any of you so-called blacks have that last name Butler, that again is a surname that could be indicative of your real lineage, right? Of your true lineage. And by the way, Thomas Butler was not the only so-called black person that was close with Queen Elizabeth I. She had many so-called blacks in her court who she would give nicknames to that would reveal that they were indeed so-called black. I believe she called Thomas Butler her quote-unquote black husband. So that should be indicative of not only his true physical appearance, but also the true physical appearance of Queen Elizabeth herself, who she was described herself as being a woman of swarthy complexion before she started to lighten her face later on in her life with makeup to hide her age. But that will be for another day when I go more in depth into the Tudor dynasty in England. but I just wanted to read a couple more descriptions of some more Black Irish men that are described from this archive. So Adam McPherson, age 24, 5 feet 8 inches high, brown hair, brown complexion. So obviously a man of color having a brown complexion. And of course, he was born in Ireland. And then James Megahune, 18 years old, 5 feet 5, black hair, black complexion, and was also born in Ireland. So we should get the point by now. There were numerous so-called Black Irish that actually were natives to Ireland and came from Ireland and had an ancient familiar history dating back to ancient Ireland. And all the people from this archival list were Irish immigrants that came over to Pennsylvania as, I believe, members of a militia group in America. But they were native Aboriginal Irishmen that actually came from Ireland. Once again, these people were not slaves that were shipped to Ireland from Africa and were thereafter shipped off to Pennsylvania. These were actually men that came from Ireland and had a long familiar history going back centuries in Ireland. And they were, of course, as we just read, so-called black men. Okay, so there are several other descriptions of more so-called Black Irishmen, but I'll just cut it off here so that we can move on. But before we move on, I just want to read descriptions of a couple of men that will act as precursors to something that I will show you guys later on, pertaining to what one of the founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, said about the Germans as well as various other people from Europe that he described as people of color. And a lot of people who want to try and discount this statement that was made by Benjamin Franklin, that he didn't really mean people like the Germans or people of color, or as he says, swarthy, but that they were only called swarthy because supposedly Benjamin Franklin was prejudiced towards other peoples of Europe that weren't of quote-unquote English descent. But this was not the case. Benjamin Franklin said what he said because there were many people of color that resided in Germany as native Germans and even all over Europe during this time. So let's prove this to be true by looking at a couple of descriptions of other European peoples that this archive mentions. So let's read this description of this man named Henry de Calver, who, as we'll see, was actually born in Germany. Okay, so let's read this real quick. So Henry de Calver, age 19 years, 5 feet 9 inches high, black hair, black complexion, and he was born in Germany. So a man with a black complexion that was actually born in Germany, that doesn't sound right, especially for the time period this document was made in, which was around the late 1700s, which would mean that it's right in line with when Benjamin Franklin made the statements that he made in his observations concerning the increase of mankind, which was written in and around the 1750s. So again, Benjamin Franklin was not lying, and he was not exaggerating or quote-unquote hating on the other peoples of Europe at the time. He was simply making an observation like the damn title entails, okay? But we were making an observation about the physical characteristics of the people of Europe and Europe that were living in Europe during that time period, as well as really around the world too. But we'll read more about that later on, and I'll just show one more description real quick of another man who was listed in this archive, who was actually born in America, but his surname suggests that he was of German descent. So let's read that real quick. So let's read about this man named Jacob Herber, and that last name Herber is an ancient German last name. So this man was most likely someone of German descent going back some ways, but anyway, let's see how he was described. So Jacob Herber, age 21 years, 5 feet 8 inches high, black hair, black complexion. So once again, this was a man of German descent who was obviously described as a so-called black man. So once again, Benjamin Franklin literally meant what he said when he said that the Germans at the time that were migrating into America in droves were so-called black or people of color, as he called them, quote-unquote, swarthy. But like I said, we'll see more of that later on in this video. But now let's move on and take a look at some more Irish that were described as having black and even brown and dark complexions to even further prove my point, if it hasn't been proven already, that a lot of the Irish that came out here to America were so-called blacks. And that is one of the many places in Europe a lot of blacks in America descend from today. Alright, so let's take a look at some more documented so-called Black Irish. And the excerpt I'm going to read out of documents the names and appearances of hundreds of colonial Virginian soldiers that derived from various places both in America and in Europe. And one of the most frequently mentioned countries in Europe that is listed is, of course, Ireland. So we'll mainly take a look at how many times this document mentions so-called peoples of color that once again actually came from Ireland, and weren't just slaves that were shipped there from from Africa to Ireland, and then of course to America. Anyway, let's take a look at some of these descriptions here, starting with this man by the name of John Donnelly, who we can see here is from Ireland and is documented as having a brown complexion. And that last name, Donnelly, itself is meant to be indicative of somebody with a brown complexion. The word Don in the Irish language is an alternative of the word Dun, which means brown, and I believe also a man with dark skin. So this was obviously an Irish name that was meant to indicate that someone was of a dark or brown skin complexion. Just like this man was stated to have had, and also this name traces its origins back to a very legendary Irish king and general by the name of Niall of the Nine Hostages. And the name Niall is where we get other Irish names like O'Neill from, like Shaquille O'Neal. And this is something I'll get into later on when I talk about the ancient history of Ireland more in depth. But so-called blacks who have that last name O'Neill or any other last name that is derivative of Niall of the Nine Hostages, you are most likely a descendant of his. I have very little doubt that guys like the legendary NBA player I just named, Shaquille O'Neal, and even the other NBA player with that last name O'Neal that I can think of off the top of my head, Jermaine O'Neal, those brothers are direct descendants of Niall of the Nine Hostages. But again, I'll get into that later when I go more in depth into Irish history. But anyway, we see yet another man of color that derived from Ireland that was mentioned. So now let's go further and see what other peoples of color this document states were derived from Ireland. So let's see. So there is John Riley. Again, he is from Ireland and is stated to have had a brown complexion. So he is yet another so-called black Irishman. And then here is actually a man from Scotland named Angus MacDonald. But just to remind you guys of the aforementioned Highlanders I just went over, remember one of the names of the Highland clans that I mentioned was MacDonald, right? And this man, Angus MacDonald, was most likely descended from the Highland Scottish clan of MacDonald. And as we can see, he is described as a man of black complexion. So once again, the Highlanders of Scotland, the original Highlanders from Scotland were so-called black. And then when we go down right underneath John MacDonald, it says that a man from England named John Matthews was of a brown complexion, and this was most likely a descendant of the Normans / Anglo-Normans. And yes, both the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons were so-called black people, but I'll get into that later in much greater detail later on. But going down, there's another man named Samuel French, who was described as having a black complexion, and he is said to have derived from Maryland, but his name derives from, of course, French, Anglo-Norman, and even Irish and English origins. So this man was most likely a so-called black European that descended from one of those factions. And then just below him, there is yet another so-called black Irishman named Benjamin Barrett, who was described as having a brown complexion. And then even going down, we can see a man by the name of John Hedgeman, who was described as having a black complexion, and his name goes back to medieval England. So he was either likely a descendant of the Anglo-Saxons or the Normans. And then right underneath him, there is a man by the name of Duncan Murray, and that last name Murray is one of the many surnames that derives from the word Moor, which, as I've stated on this channel before, during the medieval time period, the word Moor simply just meant a so-called black person. So surnames that derive from Moor, like Murray here, and then below this guy's name is a man by the name of Joseph Morris. Both those names, Murray and Morris, are derived from Moor, and they both were created by men with dark skin. And we can see that their descendants had the complexion to go along with their names and what they meant. But anyway, let's look down and look at a few more Let's look at a few more descriptions and names real quick. So here we see a man named Matthew Neely, who was from Ireland, and he had a brown complexion and black curled hair. Again, curly hair is usually indicative of so-called blacks, since we have the most frequent curly hair texture of any other demographic. And then, of course, the brown complexion is indicative of that as well. And then moving down, there is another man by the name of Matthew Fling, who was also from Ireland, and he was reported having a black complexion. So you get another so-called black Irish man. And then further down, there is a man named Christopher Scully, who was from Ireland as well, and he too was documented having a black complexion. And then under him is a man by the name of Edward Manning, and he is documented with a brown complexion, and he is also of Irish descent. And then here's another Irishman named David McGinnis, who was also from Ireland, and he is said to have had a black complexion. But more interestingly, underneath him is a man by the name of John Gale, and he is also described as having a black complexion. But the reason why I say that he's a person of interest is because, for number one, his name goes back to the Anglo-Saxons. Okay, that name Gale was an ancient Anglo-Saxon name, and I believe it is also Irish as well. But that's even more titillating. What's even more titillating is the fact that this surname Gale is also of Hebrew or Israelite origin. And this is something we'll see as I move forward with these various series I have coming down the line on medieval Europe, and that's how the medieval Europeans interrelate with the Israelites. But because there are plenty of surnames, European surnames, that go back to the medieval time period, and even back a little bit further than that, that are of quote-unquote Hebrew origin. So that is something that I will definitely address on this channel, and then even on my biblical channel, which is about to kickstart real soon here. But anyway, let's just see a few more sources that documented the existence of so-called Black Irish, and then we'll move on to the final thing that I want to show in this series. Okay, so now this is a book that documents the names of runaway European servants, and if I haven't mentioned this already, the first people who were kept in servitude out here in America were not so-called Black Africans. A lot of the Europeans who were fleeing or being kicked out of Europe were forced to become indentured servants and even slaves when they were shipped off to whatever region they were shipped off to, whether it be America or the Caribbean or even places like Australia and other areas in Europe. They were made to be indentured servants once they reached those foreign countries. And a lot of them were so-called Caucasians, but a good number of them were also so-called Black as well. But the vast majority, or the vast amounts of Caucasians that were shipped out to places like America, they are the ancestors of a lot of Caucasians that were living during the antebellum time period, as well as down to today, which is why only so few people could own slaves during the transatlantic slave trade time period. But I'll talk more about that in other series, but let's just read the descriptions of a few of the Irishmen that are mentioned in this book. So starting with a documentation of these two escaped European servants, we'll start here with this. So let's read what this excerpt has to say. So ran away from the subscriber living in King George County, a convict servant man, one named William Neal, is an Irishman of middle stature, black complexion, and has on the back of his head a remarkable bald spot. So we have William Neal, who was, as this states right here, a native Irishman who was once again of a black complexion. We've seen a multitude of those throughout this entire segment of this video, so it should be no doubt that there was such a thing as so-called Black Irish that existed. As I've already stated a number of times, the original Irish were in fact so-called blacks. But again, this will be something that I will talk about more in depth when I do my independent series on the history of Ireland. And then also, this last name Neal is indicative of this man, William Neal, being a descendant of the legendary Niall of the Nine Hostages that I mentioned a little bit ago. But he and his descendants will also be another story for another day, Niall of the Nine Hostages. But let's look at another Irishman of color that's listed in this book. So let's start off where it says Washington. So Washington described Edward Ormsby, the third member of the Saucy group, as a small, thin Irish fellow of a swarthy complexion. So we see here that this Irish man named Edward Ormsby was described as a man of color or a swarthy complexion man. And we're going to go over what that term swarthy meant once again more in depth in a minute here when I go over Benjamin Franklin's statements about the Europeans and what they looked like well into the 1700s. But we'll get to that a little bit later. So now let's move on and look at a couple more Irish that are mentioned from this book. So let's read this description of an Irishman named Patrick Burke. Again, that last name Burke is one of the names we saw earlier from the Whence Came the Black Irish book. Okay, so it mentioned the last name Burke that was found amongst frequently amongst so-called blacks in the Caribbean, that according to the author had absolutely no trace of Caucasian slave owners who had that name on that island at all whatsoever. So we should know by now why that was, and it's because those so-called blacks who had that last name Burke, or who had last names like Burke and the other Irish names that it listed that were found on the island, those were actually descendants, or those were people who actually had ancestors that came from Ireland and were most likely part of the many convicts and indentured servants that were taken out of Ireland and shipped off to regions like the Caribbean. So this man Patrick Burke, who if you look at his description states he had a brown complexion, so he was no doubt a so-called Black Irishman, or really an Aboriginal Irishman. So let's look at one more description of an Irishman from this book. So let's read about this Irish convict servant named McCown. So McCown is a slender, neat-made, important Irishman of middle stature, brown complexion, very dark eyebrows and beard. So you get another Irishman of color that is mentioned from this book. And then here we have just a few more Irishmen who are documented having a brown complexion. And then here's a description of a man with that last name O'Neill that I've mentioned a couple of times. And like I've stated, so-called blacks with that last name most likely descend from Niall of the 9 Hostages. So but we should get the point by now concerning the Irish. A lot of the so-called blacks that came to America from Europe came during the migration, as well as the involuntary extrication of Irishmen and women from their native land. And a lot of you so-called blacks that have Irish last names or surnames, especially ones that entail someone who has a dark complexion, names such as Dunn, Donnelly, Dolan, Donovan, Dwayne, Doyle, McDougall, McDowell, Kern, Dougal, Dove, Durham, and many more surnames. These are Irish surnames that mean dark or brown or even black in complexion, and are mostly in reference to the families, the Aboriginal families of that region in Ireland, or of that country, Ireland. So if you have any of these last names or any variation of these names, you're most likely a descendant of the so-called black Irish men and women that were Aboriginal to that country. So that would do it for the Scottish and Irish immigrants over here to America. But some may ask, what about the rest of Europe? Were there so-called blacks that derived from other parts of Europe that also migrated to America as well? Well, the answer to that question is yes. Yes, there was, and one of the founding fathers who I've referenced all throughout this video, Benjamin Franklin, made mention of these so-called black Europeans in his famous essay entitled Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind. This is a very controversial piece of documentation that a lot of people of different races have tried to interpret over the years. So so-called Caucasians tried to state that the reasoning for Benjamin Franklin referring to certain types of Europeans as quote-unquote swarthy is due to the fact that they were looked down upon by Ben Franklin and other so-called English white people, because supposedly they believed that they were somehow separate from a lot of the other peoples in Europe and were even better in a sense than them. But this doesn't really make any sense because when you look at these statements that he makes about Africans, and then as well as quote-unquote Middle Easterners or Orientals and Native Americans, he just describes them as they appeared physically according to what was known about their physical characteristics at the time. But we'll see that in a minute here. But the other perspective of what Benjamin Franklin states comes mainly from so-called blacks who believe that when Franklin calls the Europeans swarthy, he is stating that they were a people of color, because as we should know, the term swarthy did in fact mean people who were of various different shades of brown. And so in order to figure out why Ben Franklin said what he said about the Europeans, he mentioned as being swarthy, let's examine first what he said and then go about figuring out what this term swarthy meant during Benjamin Franklin's time period. Because as I've already told you guys incessantly throughout my channel's existence, words and meanings of words were totally different depending on what time period they were used in. And the same is true for the word swarthy and what it meant before the definition was changed. So let's take a look at what Ben Franklin said in his essay, Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind, and we'll close this video out with that. Alright, so this is the rather infamous Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind essay that Benjamin Franklin wrote. And with this, I wanted to start out at the paragraph above where he mentions the appearance of the peoples of the earth, because it will set the stage for the point that I'm trying to get to. But anyway, let's read what this has to say. So since detachments of English from Britain sent to America will have their places at home so soon supplied and increase so largely here, why should the Palatine or German Boers be suffered to swarm into our settlements and by herding together establish their languages and manage to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will surely be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion? Okay, so let's just pause right there and look at what Benjamin Franklin said, because this is the portion of this document that people try to utilize to justify their belief that Benjamin Franklin was trying to demean the other European peoples he's about to name. One of them being who he calls the quote-unquote Palatine Boers, who I already stated was in reference to a certain sect of Germans who were coming over to America from Germany and making settlements in areas like Pennsylvania for themselves. And this was something that Benjamin Franklin did not like, due to the fact that he most likely wanted a primarily quote-unquote English or Anglo-Saxon culture to be established in the newfound land that they were able to conquer and establish after, of course, the events of the American Revolution. So one could say that Benjamin Franklin partly wanted to exclude these other cultures, including the European ones, so that the English or Anglican cultures could persist in America and not be challenged by other incumbent pervasive cultures that may try to supersede what Benjamin Franklin and his English counterparts had established. Because you have to remember that the quote-unquote founding fathers or earlier settlers of America who fought for America's independence from Great Britain had done so at the time that this document was created. Benjamin Franklin wrote this essay in 1751, and of course, the Declaration of Independence wasn't signed until August the 2nd, 1776, and America's independence wasn't recognized until a few months before. So these early settlers of America were still trying to firmly establish themselves in their newfound home that technically wasn't even theirs yet because it was still under British rule. So this was the most likely reason why Benjamin Franklin was so recalcitrant in allowing the other European countries to come and invade America, but make no mistake about it, Benjamin Franklin did not make the comments about the complexion of the Germans and other Europeans that were starting to come over from Europe into America in more and more droves, because he wanted to demean their physical appearances as well as making them out to be less quote-unquote white than they already were. There's a reason why he states that the Germans cannot acquire the complexion of the quote-unquote English that Benjamin Franklin and the other settlers of America around the mid to late 1700s descended from. And if you remember from earlier when I read about the lowlanders and how they differed greatly from the highlanders in appearance, along with other demographics like the Welsh, or the English were differed in appearance.
Hold on, yeah, I'm writing stuff down. I gotta run to the restroom. Hold on. Sorry. Thanks.
Welsh, and then when I went on to read the description of the lowlanders at the time, and how they were described as being fair complexioned with fair or sandy hair, pretty much the appearance of a so-called Caucasian. Well, that was because the lowlanders came from the same stock that Benjamin Franklin alludes to in this essay, that being the English and, as he refers to as, the quote-unquote Saxons. The lowlanders, I believe, were among the first ones to speak the English language in Scotland, and that was because, again, they were of quote-unquote English descent. And as we're about to see, Ben Franklin described the English as being one of the only quote-unquote purely white people in Europe, as well as on the planet Earth in general, because at the time, the other peoples of Europe differed greatly from a lot of the quote-unquote English Europeans that immigrated to America, just as the English lowland Scotsmen differed greatly in appearance from the Highland Scots and even the Welsh. And the reason being was because, of course, they looked differently from what the English looked like back during this time period. But let's read the next paragraph to see what Benjamin Franklin was talking about when he stated that the Germans were of a different complexion from the English. Which leads me to add one remark, that the number of purely white people in the world is proportionately very small. All Africa is black or tawny, Asia chiefly tawny, America exclusive of the newcomers wholly so. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we would call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also.
Hold on, yeah, I'm right there. plus in Sweden. Generally swarthy complexion.
So the Saxons only accepted. So we see here that Benjamin Franklin gives us an idea of what the different races of the world at the time in general looked like. And this is where my contention of Benjamin Franklin referring to these other European peoples that he calls quote unquote swarthy was not in reference to him thinking that they were inferior in any way. Look at how he describes the Africans. He says that they were of a so-called black and tawny complexion, right? Which just means, tawny just means different shades of brown. That term tawny does. And then of course, black is self-explanatory. So don't we see, or don't we already know that Africa for the most part has pretty much always been predominantly composed of people with an extremely dark or quote unquote black skin, as well as a brown complexion, a brown skin complexion, right? So there should be no question that their physical appearance was correctly identified. And then Asia, or what we would call today the quote unquote Middle East, is mainly comprised of people who have that brownish or what some are referred to as quote unquote olive skin color that they have always been known to have, right? At least during relatively modern times, because anciently the people who inhabited the Middle East were so-called black, but that's another story for another day. But we know today, and not so far back in history, the peoples in the Middle East have always been of a tawny or brownish skin complexion. And then he says the Native Americans were wholly tawny or different shades of brown, even though we know today the main principal body of people who were classified as quote-unquote Native Americans were the first Aboriginal settlers of America. They still are of a brown or brownish complexion, the Native Americans were. And even dating back before Ben Franklin's time period, Native Americans were referred to as quote-unquote copper-colored, which was a phrase that was used to refer to Native Americans in allusion to their brownish, reddish skin complexion. And so my point in saying all this is all these descriptions of these various peoples of the world that he gives before he mentions the Europeans are accurate according to what we know these different demographics look like over the course of history. So if this is the case, why is it that only the Europeans are allegedly described how they are being described by Benjamin Franklin because of some sort of superiority complex he felt his nationality group had over other Europeans? So then the question begs to be asked, was Benjamin Franklin really trying to demean and diminish these other European peoples he lists, or was he just making an observation based off of what he knew at the time about how the peoples of Europe looked, and even other peoples around the world looked? The title literally states that a lot of the statements that Benjamin Franklin made were observations that he was able to make concerning the state of affairs of the world at the time. So in my opinion, these statements that were being made were nothing more than Benjamin Franklin's perspective on what these different people from these different countries looked like at the time. That's obvious when you look at the accuracy in which he was able to describe these other groups of people, apart from the Europeans, to how we know them to look to this very day. So with that being said, now let's evaluate what this term swarthy means and why he referred to these Europeans as such. Because a lot of these European peoples that Franklin lists are some of the last people you think of when you think of the word quote-unquote swarthy and what it entails. The Russians, Swedes, and even the French, and of course the Germans, those people today make up some of the biggest quote-unquote white or Caucasian populations on the planet Earth. Especially places like Germany, Russia, and Sweden. Those are along the lines of what a lot of Caucasians who are proponents of the racist theory known as Nordicism believe that the groups of peoples known as Nordics or Teutones or which just means Germanics or German people, and later Aryans derived from. So the fact that Benjamin Franklin is stating that these groups of people or these groups of Europeans who were immigrating over to America were of a swarthy complexion is quite glaring. But one of the main arguments that people will use to try and disapprove those who say that these people who were called swarthy by Benjamin Franklin because they were mainly they were mainly people of color or so-called blacks is because of the different wording Benjamin Franklin uses to describe the Europeans from the Africans. Of course, he describes the Africans as being as being black and tawny, but he describes the Europeans as swarthy, and that's supposed to mean that the Europeans weren't black because they weren't literally described as such like the Africans. But the thing with this is that the term swarthy didn't just mean black, it also meant different shades of brown, which is why when you take a look at dictionaries that were actually made in and around Ben Franklin's time period, they'll say that swarthy meant black, but it also meant tawny and dusky. And when you look up the definition of dusky in dictionaries like this one, the Samuel Johnson dictionary that I believe was originally published just 4 years after Ben Franklin made his statements in this essay, it is defined as inclining to darkness and even inclining to blackness. So this term dusky essentially meant black or dark, or like it states, a color inclining to black. So like a dark brown type of color is what this term dusky meant. But what's interesting is if you pay close attention to how this dictionary defines swarthy, it says that swarthy meant both black and tawny, which are the exact same words that Benjamin Franklin used to describe the Africans in Africa, right? So essentially, Benjamin Franklin said that the Africans were swarthy as well. It's just he didn't use that exact word for the Europeans like how he used it for the Africans. And or he didn't use that exact word for the Africans as he did for the Europeans. And also because...
Let me look this up. See what's in this. I found an old SWAR. Let's see, SWAR. Excuse me. ARTH. Probably in here. Yeah. SWARTHY. Yeah, swarthy. Dark colored. Okay. A swarthy complexion. Right there. Swarthy. Dark colored. Okay. Trickier other words. I hated that. That's why I used to go through the newspaper back in the day and put all them big old words and break them down. Because they always trying to fool people with big ass words. And I'll break them down to simple words.
The Europeans, they had a wider spectrum of brown to dark brown and even so-called black complexion people who were exceedingly dark, whereas Africa either had people who were quote-unquote black in complexion or tawny, which is like light to about medium brown in complexion. And you know, the Africans were actually referred to as swarthy by contemporary writers who lived around the same time as Benjamin Franklin did, and they were described as being swarthy. Noah Webster is one of the earlier dictionaries from the early 1800s, and he used the Africans as an example of what swarthy meant back during that time period. And then another author named John Bell, who was an English publisher and author, who wrote, I believe it was a play entitled Bell's British Theatre. He wrote a verse in that play that reads as such: "My absence and the unceasing cares of war on Africa's plains against her swarthy sons." Okay, and then lastly, an encyclopedia that was written in 1732, which was about 19 years before Benjamin Franklin wrote his observations concerning the increase of mankind. It talks about the skin color of the Ethiopians and says that the phrase Ethiopians was applied to people who were of, as it puts, perfectly black or very swarthy complexion. So even this historical encyclopedia, which again was written about 19 years before the statements that Benjamin Franklin made, equates the term swarthy with so-called black people or people of color. So it's clear that this term swarthy was a word that could and oftentimes did refer to people of color. And you know, I've seen many different journalists attempt to try and explain away what the term swarthy meant when Benjamin Franklin stated what he stated, where people use examples like the quote from the book The Truth of God, defended by a man by the name of W.C. Heathcote, and they'll cite this quote that states, "White people becoming swarthy by the torrid zone, the sun tans them," which allegedly confirms that so-called Caucasians can be quote-unquote swarthy as well. But the problem with this quote is that, for number one, it comes from a book that was written way into the mid-1800s when the meaning of words like swarthy started to change to mean anyone who could just have a quote-unquote slight tan color or an olive skin color, like the Caucasian this man is referencing in this book. And then for number two, it states that the Caucasians were made swarthy by exposure to the sun. They were not naturally swarthy, but Benjamin Franklin makes no mention of the Russians, Germans, Swedes, French, Italians, or Spanish being made swarthy due to exposure of the sun, or exposure from the sun. Okay, as a matter of fact, places like Germany and Russia and even Sweden are once again known for the paleness of the inhabitants of these countries, which allegedly mainly derives from the cold climates they live in. So these people who Benjamin Franklin described as swarthy couldn't have been so because of their exposure to the sun. So how did they become quote unquote swarthy? Well, the obvious answer to that is they had to already have been peoples of color naturally without any influence from the environment they lived in. What's also interesting is going back to the first point that I addressed, where I stated that people will try to argue against Benjamin Franklin calling these other European inhabitants swarthy because that was their actual skin tone, and he just called them that because he looked down on other European populations that either weren't quote-unquote English or Anglo-Saxon. What's interesting about that is Benjamin Franklin was not the only one during this time period who referred to the various peoples of Europe as people of color. There were many different historians and documentarians that stated that the Russians, Poles, the Aboriginal peoples of Sweden, known as the Laplanders, Welsh, Spanish, Italian, and various other Europeans were people of color, whereas Benjamin Franklin put it swarthy, black, or brown complexioned people. So let's just take a look at some of those statements regarding what the appearance of the Europeans was at the time, and then we'll close this series out. I want to take a look at how the people of Spain were described looking like according to historians that existed even before Benjamin Franklin made his statements and observations concerning the increase of mankind. And of course, the people of Spain were one of the groups that Franklin mentioned in that essay. So this will provide us with a certain level of confirmation as to whether or not Benjamin Franklin was telling the truth about the appearance of the Spanish during his time, or if he was just saying what he was saying because he thought the people of Spain were inferior to himself and people who were a part of English culture. So let's read this first description of the population of Spain during the late 1600s going into the 1700s, which was right around the time Benjamin Franklin lived. So let's read this description real quick. So the people of Spain are of a swarthy complexion, black hair, and good proportion. Okay, so we can see here that the people of Spain were described as a whole being a people of swarthy complexion, just as Benjamin Franklin said they were when he included them in his group of quote-unquote swarthy Europeans. And just in case you need a reminder of what swarthy means, here it is right here again, as well as the other forms that the words come in. The word swarthy itself means darker complexion, black, dusky, and tawny. And then when you look above swarthy, various other forms of the word are seen, and words like swart, which was a Middle English word that quite literally meant someone who was black-skinned. And then when you look up the definition of the word, and then below that is swarth, which means black, darkly brown, and tawny. So swarth basically gives us the same meaning that swarthy gives us, but it's a bit more visceral with its wording, because instead of using the word dusky like swarthy does, it already says that swarth or swarthy complexion is a person of a dark brown complexion, which is essentially what dusky meant. It meant someone with a dark brown complexion. And then it lists tawny, which means anywhere from medium brown to light brown. So again, the word swarthy encapsulates more than just the word black, which is why I stated earlier that it is incorrect to state that Benjamin Franklin delineated the people of Africa as being a people of color or so-called black from the Europeans, just because he used different wording to describe the Europeans as swarthy as opposed to the Africans being described as black or even tawny. And that doesn't mean that he wasn't saying that they too weren't people of color. The word swarthy encapsulates both black and tawny anyway, as we can clearly see in this definition. So again, Benjamin Franklin was basically just saying that the Europeans he mentioned had complexions that could range anywhere from black to dusky, or a more dark brownish color, to even swarthy or medium to light brownish in color. But either way, he was describing them as people of color or so-called black. But anyway, let's look at one more description of the people of Spain. But with this description, I'm going to use the Memoirs of the Secret Services of John Mackey book. And the author of this book, a Scottish spy named John Mackey, is going to describe a couple of noblemen who had complexions that he deemed fit to liken unto the Spaniards because it was their general appearance during that time. So let's see what I'm talking about right here. So now let's read this description of first Daniel, Earl of Nottingham, who was a very important political figure during the transition of power from the House of Stuart to the House of Hanover. And I could really utilize this book and the descriptions John Mackey gave of these noblemen as more evidence of a so-called black presence that existed in Europe well into the 1700s. But I'll probably use it for another video series later on. But let's just read what John Mackey says about the appearance of Daniel, Earl of Nottingham, and who he likened his complexion to. So we'll start here where he says he had also the exterior air of the business and application enough to make him very capable, in his habit and manner very formal, a tall, thin, very black man, like a Spaniard or a Jew. So we see here that John Mackey says that Daniel, Earl of Nottingham was a black man, which of course would be somebody that we will classify today as so-called black. So he was a so-called black man. and he equates being a black man or a black person to being either a Spaniard or even a Jew. Now, I'll get to the Jew part later on because that is also very revelatory, but the fact that this man being described as a so-called black man and that being likened unto the appearance of a Spaniard should let you know that the Spaniards must have looked like that was what the Spaniards must have looked like at the time. Again, the Spaniards were called swarthy by Benjamin Franklin, and one of the definitions of swarthy is black, right? So again, for you people who said that Benjamin Franklin wasn't calling the Europeans black or people of color just because he didn't quite literally use the word black to describe their complexions, please do some more digging and check out what that term swarthy meant, as well as what other terms and definitions of terms meant at the time that they were being used. Because as we're seeing right now, the people of Spain were a people of color during Benjamin Franklin's time, and even during John Mackey's time, which predates Franklin a little bit because he did a lot of his spy work in England during the time of the Glorious Revolution in between 1688 to 1710, and I believe he ended up dying in 1723, and Benjamin Franklin wasn't born until 1706, and didn't start a lot of his work until like the mid 1700s. But still, they lived around the same time period, and during the time period of being alive, the people of Spain were in fact so-called blacks or people of swarthy complexion. But let's look at one last description John Mackey gives of a man who he describes as so-called black and likens him to a Spaniard. So this is going to be a description of John Methuen, the ambassador to the King of Portugal at the time. So let's read what he has to say about this man's appearance and why it's likened unto a Spaniard. So he is a man of intrigue, but very muddy in his conceptions, and not quickly understood in anything. And his complexion and manners, much of a Spaniard, a tall black man, 50 years old. So again, we see another man who was likened unto a person from Spain at the time, because he was also of a so-called black complexion and was a black man himself. So again, the Spanish at the time had to be a people of color just by looking at how their complexion was described by Benjamin Franklin and what that term swarthy meant during his day, and even how John Mackey compares the complexion of a so-called black man to that of a Spaniard or a person from Spain at the time. So there we have the Spanish, but another interesting group of people Benjamin Franklin mentioned were the Russians. Like I stated earlier, Russia today has one of the most prolific so-called Caucasian populations in the world, and their complexions are also some of the most pale in the world as well. So it's interesting that they would be included in this description that Benjamin Franklin gives of quote-unquote swarthy Europeans, considering what we know that term swarthy to have meant. But let's take a look at how some historians that lived during Benjamin Franklin's time period in and around when he made the statements about the Russians being swarthy. Alright, so now let's look at this book, which was a memoir of the subject from my last video, Napoleon Bonaparte. And even though the author is listed as some French playwright named Antoine Arnault, I'm pretty sure this was originally written by Napoleon himself, since it's his own memoir. But anyway, let's read the very interesting statement that Napoleon makes about the complexion of the Russians, and keep in mind what the people of Russia look like today when we read this quote, to understand that the people that inhabit Russia today were not the same people Napoleon describes in this passage from his memoir, nor how Benjamin Franklin describes the Russians in his essay. So let's read what this has to say. So the Russians wore boots of leather, the new powerful odor of which the people imagined emanated from the Russians themselves. Several were wounded and covered with the blood dried upon them, which shone and appeared black as jets. The Russians were of very dark brown complexions, and their hair was cut close to the head. So now, this right here is describing the appearance of some Russian soldiers, I believe, and from his description we see that the Russians are described as having dark brown complexions. Now again, just comparing the people of Russia today to how the Russians were described here, how many Russians have complexions like this? I'm talking about so-called Russians that were born in Russia. How many of them have complexions that could be described as quote-unquote dark brown? Again, Russia was one of the highest so-called, or has one of the highest so-called Caucasian populations in the world, and they are amongst the most pale people in the world as well. So how could these native Russians have had the complexion that they had if, again, they were a different type of people from the Russians who inhabit that country today? Just like how the Russians who Benjamin Franklin described as swarthy were different from the Russians who reside in Russia today as well. Again, keep in mind what swarthy meant. Swarthy was a word that originally meant black, dusky, and tawny in complexion. That's what it meant, and the word that was a slight alteration of swarthy would pretty much have the same meaning as which was swarth, meant black. That word swarth meant black and even darkly brown, right? which is what I stated that term dusky for the most part meant. So this first-hand account describes what the Russians looked like at the time, which was around, I believe, the early 1800s, a little bit after Benjamin Franklin's time, but still within the same vicinity of time. But this description fits what Benjamin Franklin stated about the Russians being so-called swarthy in complexion. So again, the Russians around this time period had to have been people of color or so-called black. But the description that's given in this book only gives a rundown of the appearance of some Russian soldiers who, although they may have come from Russia, they of course aren't the whole population of Russia. So now let's look at a more general description of the Russians as an entire population. So let's read this excerpt real quick about the general population of the Russians and even some other European groups. So Dr. J.R. Forster observes that the Bohemians, Poles, Russians, and Slavonians have in general a brown complexion, black eyes, and black or brown hair. So here again, we see that the Russians, along with the Polish, Bohemians, which is like a Czechoslovakian type, and then the Slavonians, which is in Croatia, were described by this man, J.R. Forster, who I believe his full name was Johann Reinhold Forster, who was a German naturalist and Calvinist pastor who lived during the time period of Benjamin Franklin and wrote a lot of his literature around Franklin's lifetime as well. But this man describes all these ethnic groups in Europe as having brown complexions. In the case of the Russians, it's the same exact description we just saw from Napoleon's memoirs, and again, it falls right in line with what Benjamin Franklin stated about the Russians at the time being a people of swarthy or anywhere from black to different shades of brown in complexion. And again, this man, J.R. Forster, lived during Benjamin Franklin's era in history, so the fact that these two descriptions match one another should show that, for number one, this is how the Russians actually looked like, and two, Europe must have looked real different at this time from what it does today. Because when you just look up the general population of these other nations of people that are listed, again, like the Russians, their population is predominantly so-called Caucasian, and their complexions are anywhere from pale to maybe slightly tan, which derives from mostly when they bask in the sun during the summer, but their natural complexions are actually pale. None of the descriptions I read of the Russians and even these other European peoples that are listed in this particular description indicate that they only are brown in complexion because their skin has been tanned by the sun. So these were most likely the natural complexions of the Russians, and one last indicator that could be used in order to confirm that the Russians were originally of a brown or even of a so-called black complexion is how they created their icons to originally look like them in their complexion. So let's just take a look at a few things regarding the Russian icons and how they originally made their icons to look. So let's start off by reading this entry that describes the appearance of a Russian icon. I believe this icon is meant to depict the Mother Mary, as well as other religious figures that the Russians also created icons of. So let's read what this has to say. So this celebrated desolate place of the Iberian Mother consists of one undivided area. She herself, however, is in a kind of sanctuary hollowed out at the further end. The immediate space in front is adorned with many pictures of saints and filled with silver candlesticks and other glittering ware. She sits in the half-darkened background in the midst of golden pearls. Like all Russian saints, she has a dark brown, almost black complexion. Okay, so again, these Russian icons that were made by the Russians themselves had dark brown, almost black complexions. Now, what group of so-called Caucasians would try to depict figures like the Mother Mary and even other Christian saints like the apostles and even figures that
I love pearls.
they venerated for their own pantheon of Russian historical figures that they deemed to be quote-unquote saints like this, like a dark brown complexion. We know how the Caucasian tries to depict religious figures like Christ and even the apostles today. So why would these Russians, if they truly were the direct ancestors of the Russians today, and if they looked like how the Russians look today, depict their religious figures with dark brown, almost black complexions? Here's an example right here of the quote-unquote Iberian Mother, or Mother Mary, and how she was depicted in a Russian icon. She is also surrounded by other quote-unquote saints or the 12 apostles, who are all depicted as dark brown, almost so-called black skin. And so this is how the original Russians depicted these historical, religious figures, because they themselves were of this complexion. We can see that in the form of how they depicted other Russian historical figures in their history, such as Saint Vladimir the Great and his son Boris and Gleb right here, and then even in this depiction right here, which depicts the glorification of Boris and Gleb as saints in the Russian Christian pantheon. you can see all these people are depicted as so-called black people with dark brown complexions. And then here's an icon of the quote-unquote old believers who were mainly Russian Eastern Orthodox Christians who maintained the rights and practices of the Russian Orthodox Church. And as we can see here, these are all so-called black people. And then even figures like this man right here, who was a Russian reverend named Nikola Sviatosha, if I'm not mistaken, but he right here is clearly depicted as a black man here with a brown complection. And then the last one I'll show is a man by the name of Saint Dmitry Rostovsky, who you can clearly see here was depicted as a man with that same brown or so-called black skin complexion. And he is clearly depicted here in this Russian icon as a so-called black man. So you guys should get the point by now, right? The Russians were indeed a people of color, just as Benjamin Franklin stated they were, as well as the other people aside from stated they were.
I just knew it.
And the original people of Russia descended from a group of Vikings who were known as the Kievan Rus, which is where Russia itself gets its name from. And the Kievan Rus were mainly comprised of Swedish Vikings. And how did Benjamin Franklin describe the Swedes? As swarthy too, right? So that even covers the Swedes as well, but I'll get more into that and how the Rus and the Swedes relate to one another in my next series.
So don't get upset from this because we was all set up by the extraterrestrials.
So that'll be for the next series. But before I close this video out,
don't get
I
upset.
just want to show you guys a few examples of the quote-unquote swarthy Germans that Benjamin Franklin outlined the most of out of all the other Europeans in his essay. These swarthy Germans descended from the people of Germany who inhabited that country during the medieval time period and even a little bit before. These medieval so-called black or swarthy Germans were of course all over the place and made up the bulk of the population in Germany during this time, just as Benjamin Franklin said they did. But just one area of Germany where these so-called black Germans could be seen very frequently at was a province known as Bavaria, which is near the southeastern side of Germany. One of the most prominent families of this area were a family by the name of the von Grumbachs. And the von Grumbachs were, of course, so-called blacks, which is evidenced by one of their coats of arms right here. This is clearly an image of a so-called black person that is displayed on this crest. But I can already see the comments now pertaining to why this so-called black man is on this German family coat of arms. Oh, this guy was a slave. Oh, he was just an African servant.
Nah, you ain't gonna have on no crest.
They had an affinity for whatever reason.
No.
So they just decided to paste this image on their familiar crest because they felt like he was part of their family. You know, the same nonsensical reasons that certain people try to use to justify why there is a so-called black man or black woman that is plastered on the front of a European familiar coat of arms. But many of the von Grumbachs were depicted as so-called black. Two examples can be seen right here. Well, actually, excuse me, the woman that is depicted on the right was a member of the Grumbach family, but the man on the left, who was her husband, was the member of another German royal family known as the Maybachs or Massbachs. Okay, so, but sorry, you know, there are just so many German so-called black royal families that sometimes I just get them mixed up, you know. But yes, these two right here are examples of these swarthy Germans that existed. I want to say a little bit after the medieval time period, or right at the tail end of the medieval time period. But either way, these are two examples of so-called black Germans. And then here's another member of the Grumbach family who was named Argula von Grumbach, and she is clearly depicted here on this coin as a so-called black woman. You can see the pronounced thick lips and flat nose that she had. So this is obviously a so-called black woman right here, who again was a member of the prominent Bavarian noble family known as the Grumbachs. So the Grumbachs were just one Bavarian royal family, but there were a bevy of them sprinkled all throughout once again, just as one province in Germany. Here's one right here. These people were known as the Pappenheim family, and as you can see, their family crest features a so-called black man with a crown atop his head. And then here is a crest that represents a family from a region in Upper Bavaria known as Markt Mittenwald, if I'm not mistaken. And then here's the crest of an ecclesiastical or predominantly Catholic Christian province within Bavaria known as Freising. And this crest was normally meant to represent the bishops of this area and the German town. And as we can see, the bishops of Freising, their crest was the image of a so-called black man with a crown atop his head. So again, What we with Caucasians during the medieval time period would represent themselves with a black man with a crown. Just like we saw with the Grumbach family, the reason why these families and other Bavarian provinces had these so-called blacks on their coats of arms was because the people who inhabited this area were so-called black. But if you still don't believe me, or if you still don't believe this, here is a manuscript dated at around the late 14th century. This manuscript depicts the Bavarians as so-called black people. As we can see here, both these Bavarian knights and this, what looks like a priest of some sort, are depicted as so-called black. And then here is another scene from the manuscript that once again shows the people of Bavaria at the time to have been people of color or so-called black. And then here's yet another page that shows a Bavarian man getting apprehended, and he, along with everyone else in the scene, are clearly people of color. And then here's a scene that depicts some sort of conflict or battle that occurred, and all the faces that you can see in the scene that were in this conflict are so-called black in color. And then I'll show one last image from this manuscript, which shows Christ in the middle, and which shows Christ in the middle, and two either angels or knights. I believe these are two knights because they have shields with the cross of Saint George on them, which was a symbol that the knights had, which is a symbol that the knights brandished during the medieval time period or the Middle Ages, oftentimes. But anyway, whether they're knights or angels, the people of Bavaria chose to depict them as so-called black, and also they chose to depict Christ as a man of color as well. So again, the people of Bavaria were indeed so-called black people, and they were just one portion of the quote-unquote swarthy Germans that existed all over Germany well into the 1700s during Franklin's time period of being alive, that were migrating into America. And it should be obvious by now that Benjamin Franklin called all of these European immigrants that were coming to America swarthy because they actually were as such. They were peoples of color. Just as I've been able to show by using examples from other people who have attested to this being the case. So all these events, along with a bevy of other things that transpired from the mid to late 1600s into the late 1700s, are how a lot of so-called blacks in America that have ancestors going back to Europe got here. But I'll discuss more of that stuff as I move forward with these different series I have coming down the line on the medieval time period.
Let me go back. Okay, I'm looking for the specific, I seen the other day. Where did the black go? I watched the other night. Liberia. I think this is it.
School's out, heading into halftime. Yogurt with 6 grams of protein.
This is good. So good.
Protein, calcium, fun! It's the win for the home team! Yogurt, play on.
To switch phones, you have to be open to what's new. And in the early 1800s, a radical idea began to take shape on the shores of West Africa. The creation of a new nation for free black Americans. Its name would be Liberia, the land of the free. For some, it was a dream of return, a chance to reconnect with ancestral roots and build a new black republic, far from the horrors of slavery. For others, it was a forced exile, a way to remove free black people from the United States, rather than accept them as equals.
Now that was
Liberia's
cold.
founding was a product of hope,
I'm gonna move
fear,
your ass to the side where I'm
racism,
take
and
your damn
resistance.
land.
All
Fuck you, I'm gonna
colliding
become
in a
you.
pivotal moment in history. Backed
Still
by
doing it.
white colonizationists, yet led by visionary black pioneers, Liberia's story is one of extraordinary ambition and deep contradiction. To understand Liberia is to understand one of the most controversial chapters in the black freedom struggle and the legacy it left behind, both in Africa and America. In New England, enslaved African Americans were promised freedom in exchange for military service. By the end of the war, they made up 1/5 of the Northern Continental Army. After American independence, the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality began to take root. Many states that had enlisted enslaved soldiers either freed them at the outset or promised manumission at the end of their service. In 1807, the British took control of Sierra Leone, a colony on the west coast of Africa. Sierra Leone had already become a resettlement site for black loyalists, freed African Americans who had fought for the British during the Revolutionary War. But the black poor were reluctant. Many feared they were being deceived and sent back into slavery. Others were skeptical of settling in a region where slave traders were still active. To persuade them, the British government had to guarantee their freedom in writing and even threatened them with vagrancy laws. In 1787, the first group of settlers arrived in Sierra Leone. They established Grenville Town on the western coast of Africa, but the colony faced immediate challenges. Disease, particularly malaria, and conflicts with indigenous tribes decimated the population. Despite these setbacks, Sierra Leone persisted. In 1791, the Sierra Leone Company took over the colony, aiming to ensure its survival and profitability. Around the same time, 1,190 Black Americans arrived, forming the majority of the settlers, who established Freetown, the first permanent settlement. But tensions soon arose. The Sierra Leone Company, led by a board of directors in London, appointed a white governor and council, excluding black settlers from governance. The company also monopolized trade and imposed a land tax, contrary to the promises made to the settlers. In 1808, after years of instability and financial losses, the British government took direct control of Sierra Leone. Over the next 6 decades, the colony became a hub for recaptured Africans, over 150,000 individuals freed from slave ships by the Royal Navy's anti-slave trade patrols. The idea of resettling free blacks from the New World to Africa gained traction in intellectual circles after the American Revolutionary War, and even more after the Haitian Revolution. Abolitionists and clergy of the Church of England began discussing how best to civilize Africa and India with European culture and Christianity. These discussions laid the groundwork for what would become the colonization movement. Even before the formal colonization movements gained traction, a growing class of free black intellectuals and businessmen were already laying the groundwork for a Back to Africa movement of their own. Among these early visionaries was Captain Paul Coffey, a shipowner, entrepreneur, and one of the wealthiest black Americans of his time. Inspired by the models of English merchants and colonial planters, Coffey dreamed of establishing a transatlantic trading empire that would connect the United States to Africa. Nearly a century before Marcus Garvey's Black Star Line, Coffey envisioned a mercantile network that would empower black communities on both sides of the Atlantic. He believed that a thriving black-led economy in Africa could provide a homeland for African Americans while uplifting the continent. In 1811, Coffey founded the Friendly Society of Sierra Leone, a cooperative organization aimed at encouraging black settlers and indigenous Africans to cultivate the land and trade their produce. He made 2 trips to Sierra Leone in 1811 and 1812, laying the groundwork for his ambitious plans. Upon his return to the United States, Coffey traveled to Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York to promote the formation of the African Institution, a black-led organization modeled after the British Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor. The African Institution had self-contained branches in each city and was tasked with coordinating a black-directed emigration movement. On December 10, 1815, Coffey made history using his own funds. He transported 38 African Americans from the United States to Sierra Leone. When they arrived on February 3, 1816, these passengers became the first African Americans to willingly return to Africa through a black-led initiative. At first, Coffey's vision garnered support from prominent black leaders like Richard Allen, founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and Daniel Coker, a minister and abolitionist. They shared his dream of a wholesale African-American return to the continent. However, their support was conditional. They distrusted the American Colonization Society, ACS, which they saw as a tool to remove free blacks from the United States and strengthen the institution of slavery. In 1817, a meeting was held at Richard Allen's Bethel AME Church to discuss Coffey's colonization program and the work of the African Institution. The attendees, free black leaders and community members, unanimously opposed the idea of colonization. Many argued, America is more our country than it is the whites. We have enriched it with our blood and tears. For many black Americans, the United States was their home. and they refused to abandon the enslaved population, still suffering under the yoke of slavery. When Paul Coffey died on September 7, 1817, his dream of a black trading empire died with him, but his efforts laid the groundwork for future discussions about black immigration and self-determination. By 1816, the black population in the United States had grown to 1.5 million and were considered a growing race problem. Over 200,000 blacks had been freed only to exchange servitude for an existence as outcasts, living with degradation and discrimination. A policy trending towards segregation, already established in Indian affairs, quickly began to develop along with negative attitudes toward race mixing. In the early 19th century, the United States was a nation grappling with its identity. The Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804, which resulted in the first black republic in the Western Hemisphere, sent shockwaves through the American South. Fearing that news of Haiti's victory would inspire slave rebellions, Southern planters and politicians worked hard to suppress information about the revolution. Yet, the specter of Haiti loomed large, intensifying congressional debates over slavery and the future of free blacks in America. At the same time, the young nation was expanding westward. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, after Napoleon's disastrous Haiti campaign, doubled the size of the United States and fueled the ideology of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans had a divine right to settle the entire continent. But this expansion also reignited the debate over whether new states would be admitted as slave or free, a conflict that would eventually lead to the Civil War.
Benadryl allergy liquid for powerful allergy relief in a wild cherry flavor. Bring it.
Hey, look at you! Florist by day, student by night. PT by dawn, Dean's List by dusk. Always powered by Penn State World Campus. With more than 175 in-demand programs, Penn State World Campus delivers. On your time.
Stream free with no login required.
Napa knows that 1 in 4 vehicles will need a new battery this year. And that's just the tip of the electrical iceberg. That's why Napa believes in testing the electrical systems on every vehicle, from the battery to the alternator. And why we're a trusted solution.
The idea of colonization gained traction among both abolitionists and pro-slavery advocates. For abolitionists like Reverend Robert Findlay of New Jersey, colonization offered a way to uplift free blacks by providing them with opportunities in Africa. Findlay, who was inspired by Captain Paul Coffey's voyages, saw colonization as a chance to spread Christianity and civilization to Africa while improving the lives of free blacks. For pro-slavery advocates, colonization was a way to remove free blacks from the United States, thereby reducing the risk of slave rebellions. The memory of Haiti, as well as uprisings led by figures like Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, and John Brown, haunted Southern slaveholders. Founded in 1816, the ACS sought to replicate Sierra Leone's model by establishing a colony for free black Americans in Africa. For some supporters, this was framed as a humanitarian mission, offering free blacks a chance to build a new life away from the racial oppression of the United States. For others, however, it was a calculated effort to remove free blacks from the country altogether, thereby reinforcing the institution of slavery. Many white Americans at the time believed that a growing free black population would threaten the stability of slavery. They feared that free blacks would inspire enslaved people to resist or rebel, making it harder to control the enslaved population. To prevent this, they advocated for the removal of free blacks from the United States, promoting the idea of returning them to Africa as a solution. In this way, the colonization movement was not just about creating opportunities for free blacks, it was also about protecting and perpetuating slavery. On February 6, 1820, the ship Elizabeth, nicknamed the Mayflower of Liberia, set sail from New York for the coast of West Africa. On board were 86 free black immigrants and 3 agents from the American Colonization Society. Their mission was to find a suitable location for a settlement where free black Americans could build a new life. When the settlers arrived on the African coast, they drew up a compact, much like the Mayflower Compact of 1620, pledging themselves to the service of God and proposing a civil government under their own leadership. However, the ACS and the federal government, which funded the expedition, had different plans. They did not believe that free blacks were ready for self-government, and for nearly 3 decades, ACS agents would control the colony's civil affairs. The ACS initially established its first colony at Sherbro Island, but yellow fever quickly claimed the lives of more than a quarter of the settlers. After the arrival of additional immigrants from Baltimore, the survivors relocated to Cape Mesurado, a 36-mile-long strip of coastal land near present-day Monrovia. From the outset, the colony faced immense challenges. Indigenous tribes, viewing the settlers as competitors for trade and resources, launched repeated attacks. By 1835, 5 additional colonies had been established by American state colonization societies and the U.S. government. In 1838, these colonies united to form the Commonwealth of Liberia, with Monrovia as its capital. Over the next 6 decades, more than 15,000 black immigrants from America would settle in Liberia. Of the 2,887 immigrants who arrived between 1832 and 1842, the settlers, many of whom were unprepared for the harsh tropical conditions, struggled to adapt. They relied on funds from former slaveholders, state legislatures, and the ACS for survival. To improve the settlers' chances, the ACS adjusted its voyages to avoid the deadly summer rains. They also discovered that Southerners, who had some immunity to milder forms of malaria, fared slightly better than Northerners. Still, the colony's survival depended on its ability to become self-sufficient. The U.S. government provided limited support, about $9,000 annually, for arms, fortifications, and medical services. However, it refused to recognize Liberia as an official American colony, creating international challenges. European traders from Sierra Leone ignored Liberian land claims, refused to pay customs fees, and dismissed the colony's sovereignty. In 1845, Liberia's colonial council passed resolutions requesting independence from the ACS. A national referendum followed, with most Liberians voting in favor of independence. On July 26, 1847, representatives of the Liberian people proclaimed the Republic of Liberia, the first independent black republic in Africa. Liberia's constitution provided for an elected president, vice president, House of Representatives, and Senate. It explicitly barred white men from owning land or working independently, except as missionaries or traders, to safeguard Liberia's political and economic independence. Despite its challenges, Liberia became a beacon of hope for many free blacks seeking opportunity and self-determination. Settlers built thriving communities, excelling in trade, agriculture, and professions like law, medicine, and education. By the mid-19th century, Liberia had established itself as a hub of commerce and enterprise. The colony's merchant fleet grew rapidly, with 58 Liberian-owned vessels by 1848 and 139 by 1871. Americo-Liberian traders, often referred to as merchant princes, dominated coastal trade, exchanging goods like rum, tobacco, and cloth for valuable African commodities such as palm oil, ivory, and rice. These traders became symbols of Liberia's economic potential and the aspirations of its settlers. Yet this prosperity was not without its contradictions. While Liberia's success demonstrated the capabilities of free blacks, it also highlighted the limitations imposed by systemic racism and the lack of support from the United States. Despite the vision of figures like Paul Coffey, who had dreamed of robust economic ties between free black communities in America and Liberia, no official trading relationships materialized. The absence of a strong black economic class in the United States, coupled with entrenched racial barriers, made it nearly impossible to foster the kind of transatlantic partnership Coffey had envisioned. Instead, Liberia's growth remained largely self-reliant, a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of its settlers. even as they navigated the challenges of building a new society in the face of isolation and limited resources. Even though the settlers started to see much progress, their relationship with the indigenous population remained fraught. The Americo-Liberians, many of whom had been born free or emancipated, viewed themselves as culturally superior to the indigenous tribes. They reproduced the social hierarchies of the American South, with mulattoes often occupying the upper echelons of society, and recaptured Africans, those rescued from slave ships, at the bottom. The Americo-Liberian settlers, who were descendants of freed slaves from the United States and the Caribbean, often viewed themselves as culturally and socially superior to the indigenous African population. This sense of superiority was further complicated by the colorism that emerged within the settler community, where lighter-skinned mulattoes, many of whom were of mixed African and European ancestry, held disproportionate power and influence. Blyden was one of the most vocal critics of this internal division. He saw the mulatto elite as a barrier to the progress of Liberia and the broader African race. Blyden believed that the mulattoes, who were often better educated and wealthier due to their connections with white Americans, were more interested in maintaining their own power than in uplifting the black race or integrating with the indigenous population. This division was institutionalized in Liberian politics, with political parties forming along racial lines: the Whigs, dominated by pure blacks, and the Republicans, dominated by mulattoes. While internal divisions plagued Liberia, the country also faced significant external pressures as European powers began to carve up the African continent during the scramble for Africa.
Hey, August.
Liberia's independence and
Right.
sovereignty were constantly under threat from European imperial powers, particularly Britain and France, who sought to expand their territories in West Africa. Liberia's claims to its hinterland were often disputed, and the country struggled to assert its jurisdiction over territories that were not effectively settled by Liberians. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, which formalized the rules for the partition of Africa among European powers, further complicated Liberia's position. The conference established the principle of effective occupation, which meant that European powers would only recognize territorial claims if they were backed by actual control and settlement. Liberia, with its limited resources and internal divisions, was ill-equipped to meet this standard, and its claims to vast territories in the interior were increasingly ignored by European powers. Liberia's territorial boundaries were once far more expansive than they are today. At its height, the colony claimed vast stretches of land along the West African coast, including areas rich in resources like palm oil and rubber. However, during the scramble for Africa, European powers like Britain and France aggressively expanded their colonial holdings, often at Liberia's expense. To the northwest, Britain annexed the Galenas territory and parts of the Mano River region, which are now part of modern-day Sierra Leone. To the east and north, France claimed the Kavala River region, now part of Ivory Coast, and the Nunes River region, now part of Guinea. European powers justified these encroachments by arguing that Liberia lacked effective control over these territories, a critique rooted in both geopolitical ambition and racial prejudice. By the early 20th century, Liberia's borders had been significantly reduced, leaving the nation surrounded by British and French colonies. This territorial loss was not just a blow to Liberia's geographic size, but also a stark reminder of its precarious position as one of the few independent nations in a continent increasingly dominated by European empires. The country's inability to effectively occupy and administer its hinterland left it vulnerable to European encroachment. Liberia's lack of military and economic power made it difficult to resist these incursions. The Republic's survival depended on its ability to navigate the complex politics of European imperialism while maintaining its independence. Externally, Liberia faced the relentless pressures of European imperialism as the scramble for Africa threatened to engulf the small republic. Yet, against all odds, Liberia joined Ethiopia as one of only 2 African nations to maintain its independence during this era of colonial expansion. This remarkable achievement underscored the resilience and determination of Black people to carve out a space of their own in a world dominated by colonial powers. Thanks for watching. If you found this story insightful, Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
Now this lady, let me go back. She says that they didn't have an issue. Where is it at?
That's what they meant by bringing their cultures and traditions.
Here are some facts about Liberia. The indigenous people of Liberia make up 95% of the population. Even though English is the official language of Liberia, there are 32 different indigenous languages spoken in Liberia today. When the American Liberians came over to Liberia, they did not displace anybody. Okay? There's no connection between Palestine and Liberia, because our people were not displaced. The American Liberians had to purchase lands. They had to buy lands. They did not come in, bombard, and bully people off of their lands. They had to purchase lands from the chiefs in those areas at that time. Like I said earlier, the indigenous people make up 95% of the population. They were never enslaved. How can 5% of the population enslave 90% of the population? That never happened. Not in this lifetime, okay? No Wikipedia post you read is going to tell you the entire history of Liberia. You need to ask Liberian people about their history.
That's what they meant by bringing their cultures and traditions.
So she said that was a lie. That the blacks did not try to dominate the natives there.
In the 1800s, thousands of black Americans packed their lives.
Oh, what else I want to look at? Oh, okay. Now let's go back to who started this mess. One of them that started this mess. We're gonna look at this again, right here.
Back. So you want?
We put in the work. EMPRESS.
I'm gonna show this because I want you to see who started this mess.
No bueno.
Rahubat, so you want to know about the extraterrestrials, yeah? This seems to be a very popular topic at the moment, so yeah, we're going to dive in. So people want to know about, I mean, you hear things like UFOs, UAPs now, yeah? But if we used to say IFO instead of UFOs, because UFO is unidentified flying objects, yeah? But you're looking at it and identifying it, so obviously we changed that to identified flying objects. That's what they should really be called. But over time, the term that most people are familiar with now is UAP, which is unidentified aerial phenomena, right? So we're gonna get into, obviously, extraterrestrials. We say extra, yeah, terrestrial, because we know that the word extra means additional or adding to. Terrestrial comes from the word terra or the word terrain, which deals with the planet Earth. In fact, one of the names for the planet Earth in ancient times was Terra. And the terrain deals with the terrain. And when you say opposite to terrestrial is really celestial, which deals with the heavens above, the sky, etc. So anything that's extra on the terrain or the planet Terra is known as extraterrestrial. So all of these terms and names is relating to the different beings and entities. So what we're going to cover today is the extraterrestrial species and how the people on the planet, how the races relate to these extraterrestrials. Now, what's actually interesting is that now that it's becoming a popular subject, everybody's jumping on it. But if you look at any books and scrolls that Partner Babyanun, the master teacher, Dr. Malachi Ziyun put out, he's the only person from the get-go that came saying, I'm an extraterrestrial from another planet called Risk, right? Planet Risk, spelled like this. And back then everybody was like, you're crazy, ridicule, laughing.
But look at all the posters. Every poster you ever see him with, see a craft in the background. Look at this one, craft. Go back and look at all the books that he has actually put out. He would always have crafts or him coming down from a craft. And so, you know, there's a book put out called The Man from Planet Risk, yeah, which is now becoming The Man from Planet Risk. And this book is so popular, not only because it was talking about him being an extraterrestrial from the planet Risk, but he was giving out information about different extraterrestrials on the planet and how they've had an involvement with the government, etc., and giving out information about many projects that were going on at the time, which many people weren't familiar with. But we're going to dive into the different species of extraterrestrials. We're going to start off with these, right? These are called the Deros, and their leader of the Deros is known as Yabahan. All right, Yabahan, that's him, right? The Deros is a group of insane cave dwellers, and they were called the Sunuwinim, meaning the obese ones, or Samin, and the Abanderos, or as they are called today, Deros, which is a combination of the words detrimental and robots. That's where you get the word Deros from, because two parts, detrimental and robot. These Sumuin or Deros really exist. Their chief is known as Yabahan, as I mentioned before. The Sumuinians are constantly in conflict with the group of beings called the Duanis, who hold the same belief that they too will take over the planet one of these days, right? The planet Earth. They are born by hatching from eggs that are 4 to 6 feet in diameter. Never before you're going to get such detail about these different extraterrestrial species here on the planet. All right, so they grow to 7 feet and are extremely obese. The Deros, who live in the caves, are degenerated so much that they don't have much intelligence. They have 2 stomachs and their digestive system is the same as that of a cow. Deros and cows both chew the curd, which means that when they eat, they chew their food and it goes through the initial stages of digestion where it reaches a large sac that is before the true stomach. The food is then regurgitated to the mouth for further chewing. This is called chewing the curd. The Deros have no fingernails, no toenails, nipples, navel or rectum. Their eyes are silver grey and they glow in the dark. They have blonde eyebrows and a pinkish grey colour skin, much like the corpse of a Caucasian and a pig, having not been exposed to the inner or outer sun. Other than their eyebrows, they have no hair on their bodies because of a disease called peptitulum mania, not easy to pronounce, and are responsible for the disease known as trichinosis and trichiniasis. They have no teeth. Their mouth appears to be full of a gummy, slimy substance. They are nocturnal and hear extremely well. They're not very peaceful and have a strong dislike for human beings. They are very human in appearance, yet far from it. Their noses are long, trunk-like, which is very similar to that of an elephant. They contend that the planet Earth was theirs originally and will be theirs again one day. Many people today who are obese are descendants of the Deros. You know, you can see people that are very, very overweight. We're not talking about just the normal average weight, but people that are like, you know, have serious weight problems and weigh over 300 pounds and more. It is not normal for human beings. It is obviously a hereditary glandular problem and is caused by overactive glands. Certain endocrine glands disorders such as hyperthyroidism or tumors of the adrenal gland, pancreas, or pituitary gland can cause obesity. It is a trait of the Deros. They are from the Deros. All right, let's move on to the next one. The next one is the next extraterrestrial species known as the Theros, yeah, which is slightly different from the Deros. These are the Theros, and you know, that's Lamsa. All right, let's get into about the Theros. The Theros, which is short again from integrative or constructive, are a subsurface race that usually keep the Deros in check. The Theros were the original tribe of the Lunarians who came to this planet to dwell beneath the surface of the Earth. They are referred to as the Sunanans, meaning the yearly ones. The Deros were for disagreeable people and the Theros were for agreeable people. Their chief named is Lamsa. The Theros came from the planet Jomon, right? So Jomon is spelled Jomon, right? That's the planet they came from. From Jomon in the star constellation known as Arcturus, which is in the Boots constellation. Arcturus, the red giant, the fourth brightest star in the heaven, is where much mixing took place. So the Sunayans have 48 chromosomes instead of the normal 46 that humans have on the Earth. The Teros chromosome structure is so different from Earthlings that when mixed with certain humans, it caused a defect of 47 chromosomes, which today is called Down syndrome. Down syndrome can be found in all races of the planet Earth. For every 800 children out of 1,000 children are being born on Earth has this trait, Down syndrome. Their children are usually born with breathing defects as well as congenital heart disease, and they also have poor digestive systems. Their immune system is unable to function properly, and they are more apt to developing leukemia. The Teros that have an abundance of pigmentation in their skin are descendants of the Shuyuk. Those who are lacking in pigmentation are descendants of the Halibids, the Flugorods, or the Hulu. The Teros bored further into the earth and were able to keep their sanity. Because of crossbreeding, the Teros took on different forms, and others look so human they can come to the surface and not be noticed. And you notice they made a movie called The Coneheads, and showed beings that look like them. Right, we're gonna keep going. These are the Anunnaki, right? So with the Anunnaki, where a lot of people are talking about the Anunnaki, right? This is what they look like. So from the top you got Nagal, then you got Ninki in the middle, top, then you have Erishkigal, then you have Ninti, Enlil, Ishtar, and Enki, right? So everybody's familiar with Enlil and Enki, who are brothers. We're gonna go into who the Anunnaki are. The Anunnaki, also referred to in the biblical scripts as Elohim, are those beings who were sent down to the planet Ki, Earth, known to you as angels. The word Ki, that's another name for the planet Earth as well, all right? So the word Anunnaki means those who Anu sent from heaven to earth. They are called Nitiru, meaning guardians, by the Egyptians. The Anunnaki / Elohim are the mighty ones. In Ashuric, Syriac, Arabic, the mighty ones are referred to as the Jabareens, all right? In Aramic, Hebrew, they're known as the mighty ones, are referred to as the Giborim. The very elite among the Anunnaki are called the Denir, or the Dingir, meaning the righteous, or divine ones of the rocket ship, or Ilu, meaning the lofty ones in Akkadian. The Anunnaki, Elohim, were acting as intermediaries between Earth and Nibiru. They came to the planet Earth in order to find gold and other resources to take back to their planet, which is in the 8th planet Risk, or of the 19th galaxy called Ilion, meaning on high, which was on its way to destruction due to constant rays of the 3 suns, because their 3 suns were known as Utu, Apsu, and Shamash. They were supposed to deliver the processed gold to spaceships that will be stored on the dark side of the moon, called Kingu or Shishki, and Lahu, Mars. This is where they constructed and loaded the 30-mile-long cylinder-shaped crafts. They used Lahu, Mars, to assemble crafts to launch. The Anunnaki arrived on the planet Ki, Earth, by passenger crafts called Shams. Their planet-sized ship Nibiru, which means planet which crosses the skies, or planet of the crossing, right? It travels at ridiculous speeds per second, which is at the speed of light. Nibiru is about 2.5 to 3 times the size of the planet Earth. Nibiru has a crystal dome, giving it the ability to break down light. It has solar panels that are the size of pinheads or less, that can actually generate millions and millions of watts of energy, as tiny as a pinhead is. Nibiru was set up for holographic interdimensional transport and manned over 144,000 crew members, headed by 24 elite beings called Yahwehs, 12 agreeable and 12 disagreeable. Nibiru is also called Wukaba, meaning the movable throne. These extraterrestrials are aboard the mothership Nibiru. The Anunnaki's descriptions are dark, greenish, brown skinned, olive toned beings with supreme 9 ether hair texture, or what you would call kinky or kingly hair. They look like humans with a few exceptions, such as their eyes. Some of the Anunnaki's eyes are exceptionally larger than that of humans. They are of such an advanced state that if you confronted one of them with a weapon, they would let you shoot them rather than hurt you, right? And again, of course, now we're learning more about the Natharu, slightly different from the Anunnaki, which we'll go into a bit later. So next, we're going to look at the beings from Procyon or Procyon, beings from Procyon. Some say Procyon or Procyon. You've got two different types, right? You've got those of the Ashtar command, beings from Pleiades, okay? All right, let's look into them. The Procyonians are originally from Procyon, or Procyon, depending how you pronounce it. Their height ranges from 7 to 9 feet. Their skin texture is human-like, and their complexion is brown to albino, as well as their hair that's woolly brown or blonde and straight. The Procyonians have traits that are very similar to the humans, such as the head, face, nose, mouth, neck, body, which is very muscular. Their arms, which are also very muscular, feet, hands, torso, and they have strong legs. Their eyes are also similar to humans. There are two races, as I pointed out, all right? The elder's eye color ranges from black to hazel, and the second race's eye color ranges from blue to gray. The male have very large sex organs, and the females are very developed or voluptuous. They say to humans that they are the earth children. They want to communicate with earthlings and try to overstand human emotions. They breed or they bred primitive human beings, thus Cro-Magnon. The man came about. They have the ability to travel within time frames. They depend on being crafts for interstellar travel. The Procyonians astrally travel from place to place as a natural function. The name of their home planet of the Procyonians is translated as those who travel through time. The word Procyon is a Latin word from the Greek word procyon, which literally means before the dog. It is called this because it rises before the star Sirius, or the dog star. The Ashtar fleet, also called Ashtar Command, are originally from the Aldebaran constellation. The Ashtar Command are among many entities that come to Earth and have been circling above the planet Earth, for the most part invisible to the naked eye, since the early 1950s AD. Their height ranges from 5 to 6 feet. They are humanoid and have less water in their bodies and are pasty or pasty looking in appearance. The color of their skin is very pale and is rubbery. They have blonde hair. Their heads and eyes are similar to humans. The color of their eyes are blue or gray. They say they are here to help save the planet Earth. They communicate through speech. Their leader is Ashtar Shuran, who is also Arusiak. These blue-eyed, blonde-haired beings came to the planet Earth and are still here on the planet Earth. They have been known to wear insignias from Arcturus and Venus. You may see an insignia, it's like having a logo, yeah? And it may confuse you because some of these beings are sharing planets, since they were cast out of the 19th galaxy, Ilion, that which encompasses Pleiades. And you can read about that from other scrolls the masters put out, like Are There UFOs, Extraterrestrials in Your Midst, and Extraterrestrial and Creation, which is scroll number 136. Okay, so
You've got a lot to manage. Houston Methodist has a lot to offer. Convenient primary care, personalized orthopedics, and the latest cancer treatments in one manageable system. That's the difference between practicing medicine and leading it. For you, Houston Methodist, leading medicine.
Have you ever wondered why George Washington actually crossed the Delaware?
Are we there yet?
We've arrived. Ready your buns.
Maybe not. But either way, try Bar S, the #1 hot dog in American history.
GoDaddy Arrow uses AI to build websites that manage appointments from different places online. So I can focus on...
What you looking at, babe?
Cars on cars.com.
What's wrong with this one?
I just got promoted, so I'm looking for something more.
we're going to move on now to the Shuyuk, or the Riskians, right? So these are the scientists, all right, known as the Riskians or the Shuyuk. And Yanun, yeah, he's the one that's been sent here to break the spell of ignorance known to us as Parnabab Yanun. All right, so let's go into a brief description and their history. Okay, so the Shuyuk, meaning the elders, are descendants of the Riskians who dwell within the caverns beneath the planet Earth. They were originally called the Riskians, who originally left the planet Risk and took residence in Shambhala, but eventually had to set up their own cavern. The Shuyuk are the elders, and the master teacher says that I have taught you of their existence before in other books. I'm just giving you another name for them. They are the Riskians from the planet Risk in the 19th galaxy, Ilium. I told you in Man from Planet Risk, which is scroll number 80, that we, the Riskians, are able to manipulate our DNAs and RNAs so that we can live to be hundreds of years old. However, we don't age like you. Our time is different. On the planet Earth, from the moment you're born, you are dying. Unlike humans, we know that death is an illness. You just refuse to accept that death has a cure or can be prolonged. You know, he's broken that now with the telomeres that, you know, this is how you can extend your life. The telomeres are the end of your chromosomes, right? Do we know the secrets to life and death? We have the ability to speak any language and we communicate telepathically. We communicate in tones. A Riskian's body is always vibrating at a certain tone, which we use to communicate, and when frustrated, we learn to tune in on a certain tone to bring down the vibration of the body and just focus on one tone. You, the Melanonite children, are our descendants. As I begin to describe what we look like, you will see that we are your forefathers. We have dark reddish brownish skin while on the planet Earth, and green olive tone skin while on our planet, the planet Risk. Our overall appearance is that of a human being, yet you sense something distant in our eyes. We have very dark pupils, slightly slanted, and can be slightly larger than humans. Our hair is silver, white to black, and wavy. Our height ranges from 5 to 7 feet. Our skin textures are similar to the humanoids and tends to dry up and shine. We have normal sized human heads and faces, some with facial hair and some without. We have long noses and normal human jaws, mouth and ears, which sometimes are smaller than the normal body and normal teeth. Riskians are tall and slender with square shoulders, normal arms and hands that have 5 fingers. Our genitals are similar to humans. We have short torso and long legs with normal feet. Our overall appearance is that of a human being. We have a stern but kind and loving nature. We are the parents of Nubians on the planet Earth and father of the ancient Sumerians, Egyptians, and various cultures of South America. All right, we're going to go on to the nomos. Right, these are the nomos. Yeah, and singular is nomo when you're saying one person. When there's plural, is nomos with the S at the end, right? So you've got the twin sister, Yuruku, yeah, and then you have Amo, so you have Nomo, twin sister, and then you have Amo and Yuruku. All right, let's go into what they're about. So the nomos, on April 23rd, 1994 AD, the stars Sirius A and Sirius B crisscrossed in front of each other, which only happens every 9,000 years. Energies were shot down to the planet Earth to rejuvenate the Dogon. The Dogons are a tribe that live in Mali, who received their name from the Dogri beings, who came from the star Sirius. The Dogons have recorded the Sirius information given by the Nomos long ago. Nomo is an individual and nomos is the plural. The nomos were amphibious creatures known as the reptilians. The name nomos means the masters of the water, also called instructor or the monitors. The nomos have to live in the water. The Dogons record the landing of Nomo on the planet Earth as the day of the fish, and the planet he came from in the Sirius system is known as the pure Earth of the day of the fish. The Nomos landed in an ark. The ark landed on the Earth to the northeast of Dogon country, which is the direction of Egypt and the Middle East. The Dogon claim they have come from originally before coming to Mandi. The Dogon described the landing of the ark as the word of Nomo, which was cast down by him in the 4 directions as he descended. And it sounded like the echoing of 4 large stone blocks being struck. with stones by the children. The Nomo is said to be the monitor for the universe, the father of mankind, guardian of its spiritual principles, dispenser of rain and master of the water. Not all the Nomos came to earth. The one called Nomo died, or the great Nomo remained in the skies or heavens with Amma, and he is his vicar. He manifests himself in the rainbow, which is called Path of the Nomo. He is the guardian of the spiritual principles of living creatures on earth. Every 60 years, the Dogon, they hold a ceremony called the Sigu ceremony. Its purpose is the renovation of the world, right? The Dogons are African populace who comprehend various information of the stars. They conceive that the planets revolve around the sun just as we do. They keep in constant contact with the reptilian. The reptilian is considered a god. His name is Nomo because of his power. His power is predominantly telepathy, dominating someone else's mind, and his capabilities such as ascending to the skies. The Dogons are a primitive tribe but highly scientific. So again, now most people know that they mapped, Sirius A and B way before there were telescopes and people, European scientists getting to know about them. We're going to move on to the Donakil. Okay, so we already did the video on Yakub. If you haven't seen that already, go and watch that because Yakub was a product of the Donakil and the Teros. Okay, so this is what they look like. And their leader is known as Fukwa. All right, let's go into the Donakil. The Donakil, the center of the planet Earth, is a special base controlled by benevolent beings called the Donakil, whose original home is Risk. The Donakil have 9 ether hair texture and Nubian features. They also possess a peculiar sized brain in comparison to yours. They are approximately 5 feet to 7 feet tall. They are agreeable, having a very kind and peaceful nature. They reside in the city of Shambhala. Their chief, or the chief of the Donakil, is Fukur. The Donakil never exited the caverns of the earth to become surface dwellers. Many of the dissatisfied amongst them came to the surface, but of their seeds did these tribes of beings come: the Nubian of the Donakil and the Anglo-Saxons of the Flugerods. The Donakil settled throughout the continent of Africa and became known as what is called today the Dongala or the Donogala tribe of northern Sudan, and spread as far as down as northern Ethiopia, which is Ether, Utopia. The Melanite being referred to as the Donakil of today are descendants of these benevolent beings who dwell in the center of the earth called Donakil. The Danakil are the original people of Havila, same as the Dongolawe tribe of the Fuzzy Wuzzy. They are the same tribe and people, your original family. The Danakil migrated south and lived amongst the tribes of Kush. Thus, you have amongst the tribe of Danakil people with round faces, round eyes, and round noses. They were both the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Dan, which you find, of course, in the 12 tribes of Israel that were destroyed, and then Judah and Dan were the ones that survived, who migrated with them and became known as the Falashas after their entry into Ethiopia, which both tribes became the Danakil. All right, so we're going to move on to the Dwanis. Right, so let's have a look at the brief history about them. The Dwanis are among the different beings that live beneath the surface of the planet Earth, right? They are also called leprechauns or gnomes or dwarfs, and the legends of them has come. Their mixture with the earthlings produced defective DNA. I met the chief of the Dwani. His name was Sinclair. He could recite Shakespeare. The Dwanis master surface information and study intensely such writings by Shakespeare and other fine arts. They aspire to be like the elite of the human race, yet have no interest in coexisting with human beings. Of the Canis Major constellation, they are 4 feet tall and they look like porcupines, meaning their hair sticks straight up. 90% of their bodies covered with hair. They suffer from a disorder called hirsutism. The covering of their body is with thick hair. All right, we're going to move on to the Dracos or Dracos. right? These are the different types of reptilians, right? So you've got Hatton, yeah? You've got the different ones like the creature from the Black Lagoon, the reptilians, and different types of reptilians there. All right, let's go into Draco. All right. The Dracos are originally from the sixth sun constellation Orion. They range from 6 to 9 feet. They have a dark green to dark brown skin tone. Their skin texture is scaly. They have no hair on their bodies, and around their heads is pulsing glow. They have almond-shaped eyes. They're glowing red. Their nose is more recognizable than the greys. Their mouths are small slits, and they have no ears. They have a hole in the back of their neck from which mucus is excreted. Their arms are long and thin, reaching just above their knees. On their hands there are 3 webbed fingers and a thumb. Their torso protrudes and their chest have winged appendages supported by long ribs. Their legs are long and skinny. Their feet are more human in appearance. They have some vestigial reproductive capabilities. The Draconian group is a confederation. They are the reptilian humanoids with the subgroups, and these are the serpent rays from Sirius of the constellation Canis Minor of the 16th galaxy. There is a conflict of control between a covert species known as the Meldekian and the Draconian linked cultures and the Orion link. Then you have the gargoyles. The gargoyles are another type of reptilian. The male gargoyles have wings and are called Valkyries. The humanoid species are male, so the humanoid species and male have the ability to fly and are the breeders. These beings are aggressive in nature. Yeah, they eat animals, humans, and drink human blood. They are emotionless and do not fully comprehend emotions. Some of the hybrid species that have crossbred with the reptilian species have full reproduction capabilities. Okay, we're going to go on to the beings, the predator, and the Syrians, or what people call shaggies, right? So this is a predator being, looks exactly like the one from the movie, and you can see the Syrians, beings from Orion, okay? We have a scroll actual fact called Bigfoot, which we can also post for you to get to know more about these predator beings. Right, so the predators are beings from the galaxy of Andromeda. Their appearance are grasshopper-like, predator-looking creatures. When the reptilians captured the Romardians and took control of them, the beings from Andromeda were working alongside with the reptilians and captured some of the Romardians as well and started breeding their own race of greys, which in time led to a breed of mean, vicious, bug-eyed beings. When the energy field of the planet Risk was starting to increase and the whole was starting to lose color, the Riskians had to abort their planet and go to Orion to get closer to the Milky Way. So they moved to Mars, Lamu, yeah, where they set up a commune, laboratories inclusive when they went to Orion. The Zeta Reticulians who lived in Orion did not want the Riskians to live in the Orion constellation because they were taken over. The Riskians aborted Orion and went to Aldebaran.
Hazelnut, big chocolate, crispy, eat cream, irresistibly white hot.
I moved to.
You can never get enough teas. Get them for your husband. Get them for yourself. Deals, 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 deals.
This weekend's really big deal. Buy one, get one free men's and women's tees. Lots of colors, graphics, and junior styles too.
Yes, JCPenney.
Step aside. Look, Bullets need to finish this.
Why me? Why am I right for the job?
Because I had opportunities my mama didn't.
In the Taurus constellation, right? Some went to Taurus in the Boots constellation, while others went even as far as Andromeda. The beings from Andromeda, along with the beings from Regal and the Aldebaran, attacked and defeated the Riskians because the Riskians were not warriors. right? These beings are the same extraterrestrials beings that came to the planet Earth in the year 1952 AD to visit the US president, who at the time was Harry S. Truman. However, Truman could not handle the appearance of these beings, so the beings from Aldebaran, the humanoids, came to represent them. Again, you can find this in the scroll Extraterrestrial and Creation, which is scroll number 136. The Sirians, referred to as Shaggies, the Sirians are beings from the Sirius constellation, planet Iduma. The Sirians range from 7 to 9 feet in height. They have dark brown to pink skin, and their skin texture is very similar to humans, but it's hard to detect because it's under a thick coat of straight hair. The shape of their, or fur should I say, the shape of their heads are broad and big like apes. Their eyes come in variations, black, brown, and the pupils are much like apes. Their nose, however, is wide with a small point at the tip. The jaws of the Sirians are hard to see because it is covered with fur. The mouth is broad, yet they have very thin lips. Their ears are large and round. Their arms are extremely long and muscular, and their bodies are also very muscular. The fingers are long with a short thumb. They have long torsos and short muscular legs. They have genitals similar to humans. Their toes are long except for the big toe. They appear to be very ape-like. Only you can see the intelligence in their eyes. The Sirians are vegetarians, although some have been known to be meat eaters. They are non-aggressive towards humans and try to avoid human contact. They make grunting sounds, roar, and they can even speak. Right, we come to your favorite, the greys, which most people are familiar with or know, right? So you have different species of greys, and there are different mixtures. Some are hybrids, and so you got the greys, which most people are familiar with. Then you got the Meldekians, and you have, you know, the beings from Reticulan, Maccabians, and Echelon, all right? So let's get into who they are. So the greys, there are over 70 different species of greys, and more every day with the hybrids, etc. All right, and the greys are really a crossbreed or crossbred between humans and reptilian species. The greys are being used as slaves by the reptilians. The most common species are the Rumadians, who are benevolent. The Reticulans, Narians, are malevolent. The Maccabians, malevolent. The Rumadians are biological entities, right? Referred to as EBEs. Biological entities grafted from various extraterrestrial species. They served one purpose, and that was explorers and worthy servants, right? They were used by the Anunnaki for the purpose of exploring gold. They transported gold back to Nibiru and then Risk. When the job was completed, they were given their freedom. Some of them chose Pleiades and Arcturus as their home, where the malevolent Luciferian type reptilians chose to conquer them, enslaving them, performing biological experiments, creating hybrid. The Maccabians are a biogeneric breed from the cow and other species here on Earth, as well as mechanical and computerized technologies. Their skin colors are grayish blue and the texture is smooth. The Maccabians are a mixture of the Rumadians and the reptilians. When the reptilians captured the benevolent Rumadians, they used the cow's nervous system to breed the malevolent Maccabians. The grey beings have been abducting humans for many centuries. They see Earth as a big farm and have been basically raising and grooming humans to take them back to their home planet. The Zeta Reticulians are divided into social classes, one being hawkish, being more hawkish than the other. The more peaceful of the two appears more reclined and has demonstrated a more tolerant attitude towards humans. The other class is more abrupt, blunt and crude towards humans. One in particular are the Reticulans, Narians. They use sex, pain, drugs and fear subliminally as obsessive elements with which they influence humans. The Reticulans, Narians are originally from Zeta Reticuli. They are 4.5 feet tall with grey smooth skin. They have no hair on their thin bodies. They have pear-shaped heads with big faces consisting of large black eyes with no pupils, a very small nose and a small slit-like mouth. They have long necks that can stretch the length of their arms. They are normal in size, including their hands that have 5 fingers. They have a small torso with no stomach, so they absorb nutrients through their skin. They have legs normal to their body length. They have fully developed sexual organs. Their feet are much like a monkey's, yet their appearance is more like humans. They are aggressive in nature and also show fear of humans. They can communicate by speaking any language. They also communicate telepathically. All right, so the Flugorods, yeah, and that's their leader, known as Korg. All right, so let's find out more about the Flugorods. The Flugorods were the original Nordics before they crossbred with different races to acquire the appearance they possess presently. They are the originators of the Nordic race and live in a cavern beneath the Antarctic. Their chief is named Korg. The original Halabites, meaning to blush, or Hulu, Flugorods, became known as the Neanderthals, or simply cavemen, eating raw flesh, running around on 4s and living in a state of bestiality. They found their way into the inner caverns of the planet. Many of them took residence, while others in time used the technology and terrorized other innocent tribes. This seed moved behind the Caucasus Mountains and up into Russia and became known as the Khazars, and the woolly-haired Southern Ether Orientals of this seed were called the Asiatic. They were known as the Safrad or Safradim Jew. These are the grafted devils that Yakub created. Remember, we already mentioned, we did the video how Yakub created these beings. They are your Flugorods, original Khazars, and your Asiatic Ashkenazims. Their symbol being the universe, the moon called Umar, also Kamar, the sun and the bright morning star. They use the crescent moon and the pentagram, that is the 5-pointed star. This pale man, or Halabin Flugorod, should not be confused with the albino seed, the cursed Canaanites, meaning lowlanders, the descendants of Canaan and or Canaan of 4,000 years ago, before 2,000 years ago. So Canaan or Canaan was like 6,000 years ago. The Caucasians, who have blonde hair and blue eyes, are descendants from the Flugorods. These Flugorods now live in a cavern beneath the Antarctic. They are the father of the Nordic race, not to be confused with the Canaanites, whose leprosy is the result of a curse of a defected genes passed down to him from his mother Anis, who was an Anakite. Remember, the Flugorods produce extremely low levels of melanin, and your Canaanites also produce low levels of melanin. Both are melanin recessive. So the Flugorods is going back before the Canaanites, but they go back to like 8,400 years ago, whilst, you know, the Canaanite or Canaanites only 6,000 years ago when you count backwards. All right, so that's the Flugorod. That's just a
We chose this path because we wanted to make a difference. We need to know we're protected so we can give our best.
A small section of the many species of extraterrestrial beings. So when you look on the planet today, everyone you see on the planet, every root race has ties with their extraterrestrial ancestors. So you look at the different heights that people have on the planet and the composition of their bodies, their head shapes, their eyes, asking that question about Yakub, the big head scientist, that is such a big story that I think I'm going to read some stuff because it's a very big story, right? So you can find that story for those who have the Holy Tablets, right? In chapter 16, the Underworld. That's the chapter. The name of the chapter is chapter 16, the Underworld. And you can see a picture there of the Donakil. Now, I'm going to read some information. The best book really that goes into the details of the Yakub story is the book called Shambhala and Agatha, Cities Within, right? The Cities Within, because the planet Earth is hollow, right? And there's a diagram called the Hollow Earth, but that diagram explains about how the planet is hollow. And when we say hollow, there are actually caverns. So depending on how far you're digging down into the center of the earth, there are caverns on the way. And that map called the Hollow Earth, you can Google it and see it. There are caverns in between, not right in the center, but like in between as you're going down. Many, many different caverns. And those caverns have been there for a long time, and you have different extraterrestrials that live there. And the Donarkil, who I've shown a picture of, is one of those beings. Then you have like the Duanis. Yeah, the Duanis, they look like that. They're like porcupine beings. They are very smart. You have the Teros. Yeah, the Teros, they look like that. These are like the cone head that you would have seen in like Star Trek and certain movies that depict these different beings. But the Earth has a grid system, right, as you can see there. There's so much information. I'm just building up to then go into that story of Yakub, because Yakub, who's referred to as the big head scientist, he came about as a product of a mixture between the Donarkil and the Teros. So yeah, that whole chapter, if you read the Underworld, chapter 16 in the Holy Tablets goes into it, and the book Shambhala and Agatha, Cities Within, that goes into more detail. But what I'm going to do is, again, from even the Melaninite children, which is scroll number 133, that goes into, so what I'm going to do is just read an excerpt and then talk about Yakub. All right, so the question on page 43 says descendants of the Deros, right? It shows you the Deros, which I didn't mention, but they're like the obese looking types of beings. But then there's a question. You mentioned two other groups of beings earlier, the Donarkil, right? I'm going to write some of the words that are quite hard to maybe know. So the Donarkil and the Tero, yeah? When we say Tero, we put the plural and we say Teros. Yeah, but it's Tero. Who are they? The answer is the Donarkil, whose original home is in the 8th planet Risk. Right, so the name of the planet is Risk. This is where our master teacher comes from as well, right? It says the 8th planet Risk of the 19th galaxy, Ilion. Ilion is ILLYU. Ilion, right? That's the name of the galaxy. Have an abundance of melanin in their skin, for they are related to your forefathers, the woolly-haired beings, those who bear 9 ether, the Anunnaki, right? Again, remember, these terms, this is when he was still teaching us the Sumerian doctrine and the terms that were being used, such as Anunnaki or Elohim, which we obviously know there are different species, and you know, we know them as the Parnatharu today, all right? The descendants of us, all right, who are the Shuyuk. The Shuyuk, that's spelled S-H-U-Y U-K-H. The Shuyuk, these are the elders, right? The elders, the Riskians. It says, we left some of our hybrids on this very planet Earth. They are your Donarkil. They took up residence within Shambhala, right? So remember when I'm saying that book's called Shambhala, which actually means centered by Allah, depending on which language you're using to translate that word, Shambhala. And that's the book I was referring to. Okay. The center of the earth is a special base controlled by the Donarkil. And just like the melanin-bearing beings of the Watusi of the planet Earth, Watusi of the planet Earth, the Donarkil too are tall. See, the Donarkil are related to what most people know as the Dongola. We'll come back to that. Right, so the Donarkil have very large craniums, meaning that they have very large heads, right? The Tero are also a group of benevolent beings who lived in the adjacent cavern to the Donarkil. The Tsunamians, or Tero, which is a short for, the word Tero is short for integrative or constructive, are a subsurface race that usually keep the Dero in check. In order for the Dero to keep their sanity, they bore further into the earth. However, due to the crossbreeding, the Dero took on different forms, and others look so human they can come to the surface and not be noticed. Okay, so it goes on and it says, from the pictures it appears as if they have oriental features. And then the master teacher Panabadian says, allow me to explain. A lot of mixing in took place in the heaven, or what you refer to as the heaven. Actually, the Tero come from a planet called Jomon. So the Tero comes from a planet called Jomon. Jomon. Right? Jomon. In the star constellation called the Red Giant, or the fourth brightest star, simply called Arcturus. Again, you can find Arcturus in the Bible if you look at Job 9:9, Amos 5:8. You can find the mention of these constellations. So Arcturus, which is the Boot constellation. The atmosphere on Jomon contributed to their children's breathing defects, as well as congenital heart disease and poor digestive systems, unstable immune systems, and are more likely to get leukemia. So people of the planet Earth normally have 46 chromosomes. However, because the Teros have 48 chromosomes, their structure is so different. When mixed with certain humans, it resulted in a defect called Down syndrome, right? So you know Down syndrome from different races, they have the same traits, where the individual, right, has 47 chromosomes. So because of the 46 chromosomes of the humans and the 48 chromosomes of the Teros, you know, you get individuals that come out and they have 47 chromosomes, and this is where the result of Down syndrome comes from. And it can be found in any race on the planet Earth. Just as the Tero has many races, the Tero that have an abundance of melanin in their skin are descendants of the Shiyuk. And those that lack melanin are the descendants of the Flugerod, right? So the Flugerod are a species of Europeans, if you want to look at that, use that term, that came before the Canaanites. Yeah? From Canaan. These were like 2,400 years before the Canaanites or the Canaanites, and they were 8,400 years before, right? So they would have been 8,400 years ago, whereas the Canaanites are dealing with 6,000 years ago. So that's why 2,400 difference in terms of the time. Okay, so let's carry on. So it says that of the Shiyuk, and those that lack melanin are the descendants of the Flugerods or the Halabines or Hulu. Question, you say the Tero who have melanin in their skin are descendants of the Shiyuk, and those that lack melanin are the descendants of the Flugerods. Do you mean that the two tribes mixed in, or are they a product of one or the other, as in the case of the Adamites? The answer, it says, the chief of the Donaku called Rabboni Fuqua. Let me just write that name down. So the chief of the Donaku, his name is F-U-Q-W-R, right? So the chief of the Donaku, that's his name, and he's the black seed, married a Tero, a brown seed chieftain's daughter named Lucianus, right? Lucianus. So that's a L. Right. So he married the brown seed chieftain's daughter named Lucianus against her will. This is where the whole story of Yaakov starts from, right? So against her will, just to establish peace in the caverns. For the Donaku were being attacked by the Dero. The Dero, those are the obesity looking ones, right? So they were being attacked by the Deros. The Tero was supposed to keep the Deros under check, in control, but they were being attacked by them, and they were very violent and destructive and aggressive. So the tribe wanted to bring about a peaceful coexistence. Thus, the chief of the Tero, whose name is Lamsa, the chief of the Tero, Lamsa. Okay, so because of wanting to bring about peace, what they decided to do is Lamsa gave his daughter to Fuqua, who is the chief of the Donakil. So he gave the daughter so that they can marry, and his daughter's name was Radia. Yeah, Radia. Let's spell her name. Radia.
Put yourself in his shoes. After a primary care visit, you learn you have Crohn's disease. Some propose repeated colonoscopies. Your expert Houston Methodist team uses a less invasive, more efficient diagnostic technique to see you better, heal you faster, and keep you living symptom-free. That's the difference between practicing medicine and leading it. For you, Houston Methodist, leading medicine.
This is for the driven, for those ready to do the thing. Enroll for fall at lonestar.edu/do-the-thing.
Hi, I'm Brendan Dunn.
Right, so he gave his daughter Radia to Lamsa, chief of the Teros, to marry his oldest son named Hatif. The question is, did Lucianus have any children by Fuqua? The answer is no. Lucianus bore Fuqua no children. She, by shadow hour, left the caverns and went to the surface and sought out Fuqua's brother. Fuqua's brother's name was Yishak. People say, it became Isaac, but Yishak or Yishuk. She sought out Fuqua's brother Yishak, and Yishak lived in the best part of the planet, the enclosed garden. She was welcomed by him, who hated his twin brother. So Yishak's twin brother was Fuqua, and he hated him. All right, so Yishak, even though he knew it was wrong to take Lucianus as his own, he did. So
y'all seeing the Bible stories in here?
Fuqua.
That Bible ain't nothing but about extraterrestrials.
Like I said, it's a build up to the story of Yaqub, and it's very important to know this background. And that's Lamsa from the Terror, all right? And I'll show you a picture of how this is all of them. So you have that's Yishak, Lucianus, the mother of Yaqub, this is where it's getting to, and then this is Radia, the daughter of Fuqua, and then you have the son Hatif, right, who was originally supposed to marry her, but obviously she ran away. And then now we get into the meat of it. This is the picture of the big head scientist known as Yaqub, which became Jacob, and in other stories that pick up. So the question goes on, it says, were they the only two children? No, Fuqua and Yishak had 5 other brothers named Amo, Hassi, Rama, Aksad, and Tunde. All save the first 2 stayed within the caverns. But Amo, who was also a runaway, he lived 20 miles outside of the enclosed garden at the site where the bodies of Adam and Eve are buried, called Mount Arafat. There was originally a village within which an illegitimate birth between Yishak, his brother Fuqua's wife, Lucianus, occurred. Okay, so this is where, carrying on with the story, Lucianus was mad at her father, Lamsa, for giving her away because she wanted to marry a terror like herself. Because she was angry, she had a child by Yishak, the disagreeable, yet reformed brother of Fuqua. She did this so that the child would be of no benefit to her tribe. Many thought him unpleasant to look at. This is why. Now it's going into this is the story of Yaqub. Yaqub, who was born hydrocephalic, having the head twice the size of his tribe members, the Donakul and the Teros. Because of it, by no fault of his own, he got much attention. Because he had the head the size of 2 men. When he grew up, many referred to him as the big head scientist. Right? So he was scorned, mocked. Thus he wanted to get revenge on his people. He owed his peculiar appearance to the fact that he was mixed for the Teros, right? Because the Teros have they have that kind of like, you know, the cone head. Yeah, so the Teros look like that with the cone heads. Yeah, and then you had obviously the Donakil, they had just round heads, but he came out with two brains. So they already had big heads anyway, so the mixture of these two made him look different. But his wife, Lucianus, was herself disagreeable from the tribe of agreeable Teros, who had a dome-shaped skull. This combination produced the unsightful Yaku. The Teros lived in an adjacent cavern to the Donakils. The Terror, Lucianus, refused to stay amongst the Donakils, for she was always teased about her cone-shaped head. Thus she came to the surface to seek out the surface Donakil. And this surface-dwelling Donakil, brother of her husband, Mishak, was abstract-looking among surface dwellers, for his cranium was extremely large. This mixture gave birth to Yaku, yet they were the wisest of the wise in that land. They referred to them simply as the aliens because of their contact with the Pleiadians. Not only did her son have a head the size of two men, but two brains, both activated by visitors from both the Aldebaran and the Pleiades. His name was called Yaku, who was also known as Yakub, son of Yishak. He's also known as Yakub, as well as Yakub or Yakub El. He is known as Bar Yishok. His mother's name was Lucianus, the terror of the original tribe of Lunarians, who came to this planet and lived beneath the surface. She was not in agreement with Terror marrying Donakil for political reasons. Rebellion being weak and wicked, her trials and tribulations led to her desire to destroy men. She did not know that this was prophesied by the wise 24 scientists called the Magus or the Magat, who by the stars charted this birth 8,400 years before it actually happened. He was born in his uncle's name was Ammon. Okay, let's carry on. So, yeah, in his uncle Ammon's house, right, that was his uncle Ammon's house, located 20 miles outside of Becca. He returned at age 5, determined to create a new people and teach them to rule for 6,000 years. Now, this is how he got his revenge, right? Or tried to get his revenge. What really happened was this became the opportune time for disagreeable Pleiadians to tap into his brains and inspire an unsightly thing. He was led to have faith that he could create a race of people that would rule over his own people and then the whole planet. The people around him that got ear of his diabolical plan would ask him, will these people be wicked and warlike? He simply answered, only I know that answer, you do not. He knew that he would be their God. The question is asked, when did all of this take place? Answer, he got his idea 8,400 years ago, BC. The process would take 600 years, which would take him to the year 7,800 BC. Yet the cursed seed of Canaan, as I said before, that would manifest 6,600 BC according to their history. So he says, was this a creation of a new being? Yes, this God, Yaku, created his own Adam in his image and after his likeness. In the image of a human being, and wicked and weak-minded, overcome with jealousies and envy. He was born with a complex of inferiority and to subject the world to their wish of superiority. A new man, a kind of man, simply mankind. The hidden meaning was in the real name, Patmos. Patmos. Patmos, that was the hidden name, right? The place of my own killing, that is Patmos. In the Aegean Sea, that is in Greece, where this mad scientist Yakub was to create a new race to destroy his own people and himself. Yet he died at age 150 and never saw the completion of his creation. They were all to be healthy, strong, and good breeders. How was the new being going to be created? Okay, so Yakub made the Flugerods by genetic splicing called grafting. They were called Jews, which became Jews later, called Jacobites, to show forth his power and his wisdom, declaring himself the righteous, and he can make a people genetically and mentally weak to give them the power to rule. Then he intended to eliminate them to show and prove that he is God, always was and always will be. So then what happened to his parents during this time? At the age of 5 years old, Jacob was left parentless. His mother, Louisianus, overcome by grief at the remembrance of her home, Shambhala, died. His father, Yishuk, was put to death for violating the sacred oath of the Donakil by marrying Fukrus, his brother's wife. This further outraged Yakub, of course, because he was already deranged. However, Yakub had started school at the age of 4, and by age 6, Yakub was living with his uncle Amo, right? With his uncle Amo, the brother of his father, Yishwak, who himself, many years before, was cast from Shambhala for disagreeable activity. Thus, he also took residence on the surface of the earth. Yakub was living with his uncle Amo in his home 20 miles outside of Becca. So then it goes on. Why did he start school so young? Don't forget, Yakub had 2 activated brains. He was fascinated by magnetism. Yeah. At the age of 18, Yakub had already finished all of the schools of learning in his day and time. This is where Yakub was to convert the people needed for the breeding of his new race. And this is where the Nation of Islam kind of pick up about his uncle and the magnetism, right? So this was where Yakub was to convert the people needed for the breeding of his new race, in the task of making a disagreeable, wicked, and physically weak being with the ability to rule with a special kind of reversed knowledge. So in the making of this new breed of people, he would use his own genes, being he was from an original black and brown germ, the black germ from his blood, the blood of the Donakil, and the brown germ from his blood, the blood of the Terror, who had mixed with the Pleiadians long ago. For his master plan, he needed to convert loyal followers that would obey him regardless of who or what. This was executed by the loyal ones. Before this secret project could begin, there must be a great many people converted to his beliefs. So first, he traveled 20 miles inland from his uncle's house to the holy site where the tree of knowledge did sit.
Jesus.
There he started to preach in the streets of Becca, again making such host of converts that the authorities, increasingly concerned, finally exiled him. He and a small band of his followers, the doctors, the nurses, and the cremators, crossed northward up and over the Jordan and over to Egypt, where they took ships into the Aegean Sea to await the arrival of his guinea pigs. He died of a brain tumor and an aneurysm at the age 150. One brain exploded and killed him. That's before they arrived on the journey, right? So he died before that. But his scientists were prepared. The other scientists of his day said it couldn't be done. He departed, for they planned a plan to kill him and exile his followers. However, those who supported his undertakings prepared the greatest fleet of ships to sail. Haggai, with 59,999 followers, sailed on a journey for a home in Africa, there to stay for 50,000 years or until the new cycle. The journey took him and the prophet Yakub's followers completely around the continent. So they went around the continent of Africa. All right, and then but not before there was a great falling away and dissatisfaction amongst his Yaqub's followers. They docked along the shores of Africa. The original name of Africa was Nubia. They often mixed up the name Kuthites with the name Kushites. Remember, the Kuthites are where the Adam and Eve story in terms of Lilith and his father comes from. And then you have the Kushites as opposed to the Kushites being Nikaba's family, Ptah and Anak. They were mixed, the Kuthites were mixed Hindus, because remember that Adam has, when you see him, he has that straight wavy hair. When Hindus having straight hair, 6 ether, these are the original black man called the Asiatic black man. Again, you can see how this is all tying into the story of diversion from the Nation of Islam. Not to be mistaken with the incarnated gods who already lived in Africa and had woolly hair, 9 ether. All along the coast, the people had black skin and straight hair, but the woolly-haired people of that land refused to mix with them, the law of Nuwapu. They supplanted themselves on the seashores of Mother Africa, mixing in and taking control. These black skin and straight-haired tribes never ventured into the heart of Africa, but controlled the ports and the seacoast, and fathered the slave trade, right, of the woolly-haired from Zanzibar. So when you're talking about the people say the slave trade was by black people, it was originally by these black straight-haired 6 ether beings. All right. So given the slave the original name Zinji. When you hear the name Zinji, Zinji. Right, so that name Zinji, that was before the word Negro. Alright? Okay, so Nubians failed to realize, or today you say that black people failed to realize that through slavery your minds were stripped of the knowledge and what you did have, and this was done through one type of people, the ones that call themselves the Jews, right, today, Jacobites. So the question is asked, is it true that the Pale Jew was the first to start the slave trade in the New World? Answer, this is quite true. Jews who came over with Christopher Columbus returned with Native American to sell in Spain as slaves. Many of these Jews employed non-Jewish slave traders and dealers. The Pale Jews were the largest dealers of slaves. And it shows a picture of Christopher Columbus. Where do the British and the Dutch come into the slave trade? Answer, Jews will be Jews whether they live in England, Holland or Israel. As mentioned before, some Jews employed the non-Jewish British, Spanish and Dutch as captains of ships and for other tasks. But the Jews were the kings of the slave trade. Do not think that slavery started all of a sudden on the continent of Africa. Slavery had existed in Africa and the Middle East since ancient times. Then the Jews, not Israelites, had begun the trade. It took a turn for the worse. For centuries, Jews had a hard time starting the slave trade in Africa because even though the pale man had guns, he didn't have a match to the strength and the fighting skills of the African foreparents and their simple weapons. Yeah, that's a story for another video, but we're going to just focus on the Yaqub story, right? Because, like I said, it's a very complex story, and unfortunately, you have to just listen through it because it's a lot. Right, so people, the question is asked, it appears that because we were enslaved during the slavery and so forth, that the pale race, the gravitation, Yaqub's gravitation was successful. And the master answers and he says, let me ask you a question. Why would you think it was a success? Because the things the pale man has done to Nubians will explain their wickedness. And if Yaqub was successful with grafting a weak and wicked being, then he succeeded. By virtue of that fact, the pale man is weak genetically because he lacks melanin, and wicked because of all he has done, and he's still doing to other people. You are becoming racist again. I'm trying to break that spell. Nubians, or as a new being, you must take on the responsibility for your own actions. Remember that these Asiatic black men are the descendants of the Hindu, right? the demons of the Hindu, with black skin and straight hair, who had a dissatisfied nature. Evil dwelled within them. So the evil was already there. It was by the grace of their wise scientists who met with the elders of the Donakil did they decide to try to graft the evil out of their nature. The ultimate result was the Flugerods. The Flugerods came out of this genetic splicing and graftation in an attempt to remove their disagreeable side. For the evil lived within these Asiatic black men, the original Hindus, since their evil ancestors came to the planet 60 and 6 billion years ago. These Hindus are the ones who converted to Yaqub's plan. While living in Arabia, they became the tribe called Sheshbaza. This is, again, you can see the tying into the story of the nation. So Sheshbaza, B-Z-Z-A-R, right? Okay, so yeah, they became known as the tribe called Sheshbaza. The 13th tribe known as the lost tribe of Shabazz. So this is where the word Shabazz, again, tying into the to the Nation of Islam's teaching. All right, so named after Sheshbaza, the scientist who carried out the graftation for this weak and wicked beings of Yaqub. And there's a picture of him there. You can see that. Yeah, that's him, Sheshbaza. All right, so let's carry on. So many of the followers of Yaqub, because remember that he died, he didn't actually live to see his mission of grafting these beings, but his scientists that were low that followed him, they carried on with the experiment, which took over a period of 600 years, and many died as they was going along the coast. Anyway, many of the followers of Yaqub got lost on the way. Those that survived the journey around Africa were used in the grafting and making of this new race. For any baby, this is how he did it, right? Actually, for any babies that were born with black genes, he put a pin through their brain. Then the next was the brown. They were spared to breed, so they made the red. Then the red, the yellow, and then from the yellow, the pale. And the question is, how long did this take? Answer, this process took 600 years of grafting and separating. Thus, Yaqub's nation was born. A ruler was set over them. She was called a Europa. That's spelled, as Europe, or Europa, EU, Europa. Right? That was the ruler that was set over them. So this Europa was the empress of the land. Yet without guidance, they regressed and took refuge in a place called Pelion. I-O-N. Pelion. Right? That is the Isles of Patmos. That's right.
Yeah, it's the Jesus
all right,
story.
so then on up into the mountain region of Thessaly, and in the grotto, or grotti meaning caves, they conquered and enslaved the original inhabitants of that land, then called Yunnan. These savage beasts that were grafted from the Asiatic Hindu black men were nothing more than the original blonde hair, blue eye, pale skin, melanin lacking, grafted, disagreeable, rebellious seed of Yaqub, the mad scientist. Shameless, moralless, hair covering 3/4 of their bodies from ankle to shoulder, the beast of the field, also called Behemoth. They walked on all fours and ate flesh raw, having bestiality acts. Thus the dog was the best friend. And it says, why is the dog considered to be man's best friend? And it goes on to say, because they allowed the dog to lick their leprous sores, and to this day will allow them to sleep in their bed, eat off their plates, and even lick them in the mouth. The outcome of the graftation was the Flugerods, bred by mixing in the seed of the Pleiadians, which is blonde hair and blue eye, mixing and grafting from the genes of the Asiatic black straight-haired and black-skinned and black-eyed Hindus, grafting from the brown germ to the red germ to the yellow germ onto the new earth-bred Flugerods, also breeding the abstract black skin and blue-eyed being. Yeah, so, I mean, the story goes on and on and on, and I'm gonna try and cut it short, but just to tie it all up in a nutshell, we're saying that this person that people are calling Yakubu, the big head scientist, he came about by way of two different races that were living in the caverns in the world known as Shambhala, where you have many beings that coincide and live there. You had the Deros, who are the obese looking, and you have the Teros, which are the kind of like cone head looking beings, and they were always fighting each other. But the Teros were supposed to really keep the Deros in check, because the Deros are very aggressive, unruly, etc. Now, because of war going on between them all the time, the Donakil, they sought to have peace by mixing in with the Teros. And so what they did was, you know, gave a daughter from one tribe to the other, and that daughter wasn't happy because she wanted to marry amongst her own, which were Teros, right, the cone-shaped ones. And so she ran away. But so the mixture, the child that was born between her and the leader's brother, Fukwa brother, who was Ishak, they produced this child that was a mixture of the Donakil, who had big heads, and the Teros, who had the cone heads. And what happened was that Yakub was the result of that birth. And because he had a big head, because he had two brains, and he was being teased by both sides, ridiculed, and he wasn't happy about it. So that there was an influence by the Pleiadians who could actually like telepathically influence him by controlling his brain. He was very intelligent, obviously, because he had two brains. He finished school early, and because he was constantly being teased and ridiculed, he said he's going to create a being that was weak and wicked so that he will get his revenge and to prove to them that he was the god, because his plan was to create these beings and then kill them off after to show that he had control over them.
So did the Palladians...
Now, it wasn't just overnight, because the whole plan was to take his genes and his blood and to produce offspring, which would have come from the Donakil, being the melaninated beings, and obviously with the Teros, who would produce the brown germ. And then to take that, so what happened is all the children that were born, when they came, remember, this was done over a period of 600 years. Whilst he had to get followers, he had to basically build a crowd by preaching his doctrine and people that followed him.
But they got his body preserved somewhere.
And he loaded his ships with his followers to go on this journey. And what he was doing was, like, throughout that period, he was doing this breeding of taking the dark to the brown, and then the brown to the yellow, and then the yellow to the red, then to the pale. But how he did that was every child that was born that was dark, he would get rid of. Then the brown would then produce children, and then so on and so forth. So basically, like, if you kind of look at it like how, if you look at how Michael Jackson was, where he was dark, he had a big head, big nose, big lips, dark skin, and over a period of time, he went from being dark to light. He went from having a big nose to a straight nose, big lips to thin lips, and basically transformed. So you can go from black to what people consider white or pale, but you can't go the other way around. So anyway, people were dying along the journey, and this journey took 600 years. He himself died along the journey because one of his brains exploded. So he didn't make it to see the end result. But however, he had loyal scientists that knew of his plan of what he was trying to achieve, and they actually completed that. And this would be what people call them Jews today, but they were originally Khazars. And if you study the Jews, you have two sects, the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim, which are descendants of these Khazars. And so the word Jew, as we have broken or I break down all the time, is because they try to tie into the tribe of what they say Yehuda or Yehudi. That's what they say Jews are. and that will go to the tribe of Judah, of the 12 tribes. Well, 13 if you include the female, but they're not the original tribe of Judah. They play on the word Judah with Jew, but they're from the what we call the Jacobites, or the Jebusites, from the son Jebus. But anyway, so that Yaqub story, as I've explained, is the same story that the Nation of Islam tell, as you saw, because the person that was over that land, Shesh Bazar, is who they call Shabazz, where they say the tribe of Shabazz, and they refer to, if you look at the nation's teachings, as the original Asiatic black man. This is why in Wusabat we explain that we're not the original Asiatic black man. That's referring to the East Indians, who are, although they are black, they're dark, they have straight hair. And our unique trait on the planet as Nagaru or Negro is really 90 for hair. So that's where they had the information of the story, but it got mixed up. And then in the Bible, in the biblical stories, they tell you about the story of, Jacob and Esau, and how the birthright was stolen. And, that's a whole different story. But yeah, so this Yaqub that people keep asking about, this is how he came about, by these extraterrestrial descendants that lived in the world, the caverns in the world called Shambhala, where you find many other beings that have been here for millions of years that have descendants on the planet. So when you look at everyone on the planet today, all the races, yeah, you have the original forefathers who came from some other constellations, other planets, dwelled here in the caverns. Some of them remain in the caverns and don't come up to the surface, and others came up to the surface. So like we talk about the Donakil, which ties into the Dangalawa, or the tribe of Nubia today, which refer to that, and that ties into the Watusi tribe. And then you have the other side, which is the Pataites, which ties into Nikeba and her parents, Anath and Patar. So that's the black. And then you have like these cone-head beings that come from Jomon, right? From Jomon. These are where the Orientals, if you look at like the Chinese, they kind of look like them with, the features, and those are from Jomon. Then you look at people on the planet that are very obese, that have a lot of weight. I'm not talking about people that just have weight, but the ones that are really obese to the point where they can't lose weight. That's because they have their genetics tied into these Deros, right? And so everyone on the planet has some link to these extraterrestrials by way of their descendants in the caverns. And some people have something called hirsutism. This ties into those Duanis that we spoke about, or the Shaggy that you will find in ancient Sumeria with Enkidu, for example. Because when you look at the epics of Gilgamesh, his best friend was called Enkidu. And those Enkiduites are those hairy beings. So all the biblical stories, all the people on the planet, they relate or tie back into these extraterrestrials in some way, shape or form. And Yaqub's story is just one of those strange stories that got passed over and remixed, but it literally comes from him being, this birth between, two different people. And we talked about the Down syndrome as well, which is, the terrorists mixing in with people on the planet to produce, we have 46 chromosomes, 23 chromosomes from your mum, 23 chromosomes from your father, giving you the 46. But with the mixture, with their having 48 chromosomes, produces 47 chromosomes, which is what produces Down syndrome. And that's on every race. So if you look at a black, a white, an Asian person who has Down syndrome, they will all have the same features. This is why it literally just goes back down to the DNA and the chromosome. So I hope that's helped. It's a long story, but I hope that's giving you a breakdown of Yaqub, the big head scientist, that the story obviously over time got diluted and mixed.
I want to see Inky. Let's look at this little brief. Who controls your mind?
Want to add some pandemonium to your practice?
Maybe hello Panda.
You speak about Yakub's two brains being activated by the Pleiadians and the Aldebarans. Do we humans also receive activations to our brain from star beings? Is this basically what we would consider having the gift of foresight, prophecy, divine wisdom, etc.? And let's address this question. So if we look at the chakras that people are familiar with, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, we as Nagarus have the 2 extra above that give you 9, right? So this is the pineal, this would be the pituitary, then we'll have, that will be the thyroid, thymus, the one we call the solar plexus, the spleen, this will be the prostate, or for the female, the uterus, yeah? In addition, because I've added the 2, 8, and 9, now when we look at these, we can look at these as realms as well, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so that diagram should help us to answer the question, because
now why you
when
say
we're
like,
dealing with
look at it like as realms.
information,
Interesting.
let's say this is Alpha Nation, meaning that information coming to you into, so if you kind of look at the pyramid, they say as above, so below.
Oh, different entities?
You can see that on this, right? So it's like a reflection. And the lowest realms, right, so we would say, let's say this is the physical or the material.
Wow.
In fact, you have planes, right? You have planes, and then you have realms. In the religious world, like this would be referred to as Lahut in Arabic. You have Malakut, and then you have Nasut. So you have 3 realms, loosely, because this is what we would call the realm of, let's say, humans. The realms of humans, the realm of the, for lack of a better word, angels, and then this would be like, let's just make it simple, the realm of the Most High, as the religious world would have it, right?
6 and 5.
But then you have like the physical plane, the plane of force, spiritual, mental, divine truth, divine reality. Right, we're talking about being able to receive information or affirmation. So when we're talking about Yakub, we're saying that you have your brain, which is connected by way of the mental, but the mental plane is what accesses the higher realm. So when we're talking about you being able to receive information, you're receiving information from the higher realms or the higher planes, and your pineal gland, which is what people talk about a lot when they say opening the third eye. However, beings that are vibrating on high levels, like the extraterrestrials, they can communicate with you and influence you by way of thoughts. So when you look at the mental plane, which is here, this is where you deal with all your thoughts. So when you're thinking, that information is coming from somewhere, right? So you have memory, you have different types of memory. You've got your subconscious memory and you've got your conscious memory.
Okay,
So beings that know how, they can influence you telepathically by sending you messages, because telepathy is mind-to-mind communication. And so when you're aware that everything is a vibration and that you're receiving these frequencies known as thoughts or messages that are coming from the higher realms, this is why within the human hearing there's a spectrum where you can hear audible sound. The same with the light in terms of the visible spectrum. And so even though there is a visible spectrum where you can see light, because remember, light can be turned into sound and sound can be transferred into light. So you receive messages all the time by way of thoughts, and these thoughts could be coming from anyone and everyone around you. So you could be walking down the road and pick up somebody's thought, because thoughts are vibrations and they have a weight, they have a color, they have a frequency, and you can receive these messages. You receive messages all the time. However, to receive higher affirmation, which comes down into information, right? You have to be tuned in, or to be able to pick these messages up as a receiver. So when you're saying that, do we also receive messages? You receive messages all the time. However, if you're not aware of them, then the thoughts that come into your mind, into your head, could be from anyone and anything. Remember, you also have your ancestors that are linked to you on a frequency and a vibrational level, because you're connected to them and they're connected to you. So when you're the person in the driver's seat, but you also have, your mum and dad, yeah? So your mum and your father, who have their mum and father, and this goes on, or 4 levels or 4 generations. So each one has their own, right? We'll show the diagram. So this is you in the driving seat. Then you have the first level down, which is that's 1, mother and father, then 2, then 3, then you have, another one, which goes to number 4. Okay, so that would be the 4th level. So you have all these personalities that make you up, and each one of these people also has their own matrix, or 4 generations of personalities, which can be like 30 in all or less, because you subtract the ones that are still alive. So this is the 30, subtract yourself, that becomes 29. And if your mum and dad are alive, you subtract those as well. So depending on who's alive, you have a different amount of personalities that are working through you. And so you could be picking up their messages, or you're picking up messages that are in the atmosphere or around you from other people. You can tap into the mental reservoir where everyone connects to and pick up messages from there. Or as you say, extraterrestrials or beings on a higher level can also send you messages. Now, what tends to happen is that in the world, the people that know how to control you by way of your thoughts, they use methods like advertising, the media, the books that you read, the movies that you watch. All of these are sending you messages all of the time, and you then act on those messages depending on how you are set up to receive them and whether or not you respond to them. Yeah. Spawning, right? But we say respond. So when we're dealing with the story of Yakub, the Pleiadians, they had an agenda, right? Because they wanted to control this world. And so they had to utilize beings that are going to be placed or put in power because they were given to rule the dominion over 6,000 years. So what they did was by influencing Yakub to give him this idea of creating a being that was going to
I knew it.
Get this exceptional.
I would call myself a fourth generation American
the
farmer.
Palladians
I'm Patrick
want
Martin.
control.
Been here about almost 20 years.
What I see around the
Interesting.
property that shows me what we're doing is good. Our soil.
basically control the planet, but through them. And because they knew, because Yakub didn't make it to the end, so what they were able to do, like most religious books, they would tell you that they were inspired, by God or by an angel that was sent from God to come here. Like for example, in the Islamic religion, they will tell you that an angel called Gabriel came, and he was the one that was giving messages to Muhammad throughout. And they say that's inspiration. Or even when people write songs or write movies or music, they will tell you that they received inspiration from somewhere or someone, or they read a book. So what we're saying is that most of the time, the thoughts that you have are not original. And so they can influence you by way of, like I said, these books, movies. So most people would read a book, and in the book, they would tell you that this book was inspired from God or from some type of angel and so on. And then people behave and act based on that book. So extraterrestrials that want to utilize people on the planet, they know how to send subliminal messages by way of these prophets, these angels, or these holy religious people that are used in each religion to convey the message. So what the Pleiadians did was send messages, because remember Yakub with his 2 brains was very smart already, so they utilized his brain to give him this idea to create this being. And in the same way, when people are like meditating, what they're doing is they're sitting down and focusing and saying that they want to be able to communicate or travel beyond the physical world or beyond like the material plane, because they want to raise their vibration to the higher realms to receive or meet these beings that reside on these higher realms. And what we do as well, based on how we tune ourselves in, we can hear the voices of our ancestors, and we know and are able to know which one are sending us positive or negative messages. And it's us that decides, being in the middle, what we do with the frequencies or the thoughts and the messages that we receive. Do we decide to act on the negative or the positive? And so, because we're in the middle of this duality, we're able to decide what we do. And so, yes, you can tune yourself in to listen to the correct voices from your ancestors. You can even tune yourself in to receive messages from a higher being by way of you being able to raise your vibration either through meditation or, reading, like we say, reading Musabat. In our case, we have actually got a being that has incarnated, i.e. come down from, you know, the higher realms, and he's also an avatar who is able to receive information and then transcribe that information to us. And because he's able to do that, but obviously he has been specially prepared. I'm talking about Dr. Malachi Ezekiel, partner Baghdadin, of course, and he's able to then give us all this information from these extraterrestrials. And you can also, if you train yourself, raise your vibration, and are able to sit down, meditate, and communicate, or even travel to these higher abodes or higher realms, because the higher beings, they don't want to come down too low, because coming down is a low vibration, and to deal with all the chaos on the planet. So they will communicate to you via way of your mind or the mental. And we have a scroll called the mind, which really teaches you about the power of the mind and how you can utilize it to receive, you know, information, and to be able to pick up and discern and know what messages are designed to, you know, have you acting in an agreeable way or in a disagreeable way. We have to use these words as agreeable and disagreeable because it's not necessarily good or bad, although people tend to translate agreeable and disagreeable as good and bad. But good and bad is actually subjective. So, yeah, to answer the question again, Yakub was influenced, just like, you know, when you start to look at the actions of, say, the being they call Hitler, for example, right? The being that people know on the planet as Hitler was influenced by one of the 200 fallen angels known as Hitler, right? And through him, he was able to utilize the physical body of Hitler and basically to carry out his plans. So these same Pleiadians that were in contact with Hitler, and they put him in touch with this witch known as Madame Blavatsky, who was also a medium who was able to channel these Pleiadians and give Hitler the idea of trying to create a, you know, supreme Aryan race. It's a similar story with the same Pleiadians who were influencing Yakub to create these Flugerods. And if you look at the plan, it was exactly the same plan. And the reason why is because these are the same ones that are saying, create man in our image and in our likeness, because they wanted to control the planet. And if you look at the world today, most people will tell you who's controlling the world, who's controlling the media, who's controlling the movie and the music industry. You will see that that plan actually panned out to the point where they have been running the world and controlling everything for a very long time, until now, where that 6,000 year time span that was allotted to them has actually expired. So yes, they can control the world from behind the scenes, but if you go back, this is one of the things that Kanye West was saying. He was saying that when you start to look at the music industry, the contracts, and who's behind it and who's controlling the world today, you will see that it was these beings that were supplanted, you know, and they influence you. Like I said, it doesn't always have to be by way of, like how in the case of Yakub, where they were actually directly telepathically influencing him. They're doing that today by way of media, because the social media and the way you think, the advertising is like, when you receive a thought, it's often selling you something or making you think a certain way to buy a particular product or to follow a particular fashion and so on and so forth. So it's actually happening anyway, but you have to then be aware by the fact that when you start to study, when you start to look at how you behave. Why do you do the things you do? Why do you eat the food you eat? Why do you wear the clothes you wear? Why do you watch certain movies? Why do you behave in a particular way? And then you look at, say, the moral standards that you're using to make these choices. You would have to look at, okay, if you're a religious person, the gods and the deities in the books are the way that the people who follow them behave. So we have a scroll called God of Light and Fire, which goes into how the people that follow that religion follow the deities or the gods or, you know, the beings that are over that religion, which ultimately go back to these beings, you know, as extraterrestrials, like the Anunnaki, etc. So it's very possible for you to tune in to different realms and receive messages, as you say, from beings that are operating on a higher vibration. Some of them are agreeable and some of them are disagreeable. So it's really for you to tune in and look at the actions or the things that you do. If you really look at them properly, like if you were to stop doing the things that affect you negatively. So again, we do this to give information and to teach, not to really put anybody down. But if you say you're going to stop drinking, stop smoking, stop, you know, over exerting yourself and, you know, going to like wrong places, clubs, nightclubs, you know, sexual influences, you're going to cut away from negative influences, etc., you will find that the messages that you start to receive are going to be the ones that are going to help you elevate. So you're going to think about your diet, you're going to think about where you go, you're going to think about the type of music you listen to, what food you eat, what things you put into your body. So yes, it's a very interesting question, and the more you eradicate the things that, you know, are disagreeable to you, the more you're going to lean to your agreeable side, the more you're going to hear the correct voice. Actually trying to do out of these beings is like, it doesn't matter, they may be male or female, but let's say these ones are giving you negative, anyone that's giving you a negative or disagreeable thought, let's say you stop listening to them, right? You stop listening to the different ones that are giving you wrong influences or inspiration. You cancel them out. And eventually what you start to do is hear the voices of the ones that are helping you. Or if none of them are helping you, you're going to hear your own voice clearly. And it's about knowing which voice is affecting you, which voice are you listening to, that is going to make you grow, because you've come here for a particular purpose, and to fulfill that purpose, you have to listen to the messages that are being sent to you by way of your mind. And is it telepathically influenced? Is it something you're picking up in the environment? Or is it an external being that is influencing you? And for us, the minute you start to tune into
spells coming from
Wu Sabat, tune into the master teacher part of Babylon, it's like your thoughts are going to be Wu Sabat. They're going to be based on the teachings of Wu Sabat, the practices of Wu Sabat. So then you start to receive the highest knowledge and information, because this being is the highest being in whatever cultural religion you look at, whether you look at it from him being the angel Michael in the Bible, or you look at it from Tahuti being the being that is described in ancient times, you look at it from the being known as, you know, Ra. It all depends what culture you're looking at. Whether it's Murdoch, this being is the one that is going to influence you, because his writings and his teachings are the best teachings to help humanity and anyone who's really trying to reach the higher 9 etheric realms. Yeah, so I hope that's actually answered the question. Yeah, thanks for the question, and Badu.
Ah, moving day. You've got options.
one he did in talk about was want to see something right quick. Ah, stop. I don't think he talked about that. No, he didn't. He didn't talk about them. Okay. All right, y'all. I guess that's enough. If y'all on your exploration for yourself. Hope y'all enjoyed it. Thank y'all for coming. Thanks for the like. I appreciate it, y'all. Till next time, like, subscribe, share, and comment. Talk to y'all later.